Om Tat Purushaya Vidmahe Mahadevaya Dhimahi Tanno Rudra Prachodayat. Om Aghorebhyo Taghorebhyo Ghora Ghora Taribhyaha Sarvataha Sarva Sarvebhyo Namaste Rudra Rupebhyaha. Om Bhaya Sarvam Ravayati Sarvago Vyapako Khile Eti Bhairava Shabdasya Santato Charanachiva. Om Naumi Chitprati Bham Devim Param Bhairava Yoginim Matarmana Prameyam Shashula Bhuja Kritaspadam. Om Yathagner Dahika Shakti Ram Krishne Stitahya Sarva Vidya Swarupam Tam Saradam Pranamamyaham. Om Saradam Pranamamyaham. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat. Shri Ram Krishna Arpanamastu. Om. I salute that Supreme Spirit. May he illumine my mind, that Rudra, that one who is the God of gods. Om, I salute all the Bhairavas, all the forms of Rudra, the ones that are gentle, the ones that are fierce, and the ones that are both equally gentle and fierce. Salutations to all the energies of Rudra everywhere. Om, salutations to that awe-inspiring light and sound called Bhairava, which inheres in all things as all things. By entering into that sound, one becomes themselves Bhairava. Om, salutations to that goddess Sarada Devi, who is inseparable from Bhairava, as heat is inseparable from a fire. She it is who manifests in each and every moment this universe consisting of the trinity of knower, knowing, known. I pray to that goddess, the energy of God, who is Para, the supreme, transcendent one, who is God's self-reflection. I pray to her, who abides in the lotus, mounted atop the trident of the nadis. Om, may this be an offering to Kundalini Shakti. Om, peace, peace, peace. Jarma, good evening. So, our project before us today, and as we picked it up last week, is to find some firm footing for the practice of more advanced, let's say more delicate Tantra. Because the things we've been discussing these past few weeks have been pretty advanced. I mean, they're somewhat esoteric in nature, and they presuppose a lot of things. And to cover those things, those foundations, we decided to step into a new project, which I'm very excited about. And the project is threefold. One, we're going to try to understand all the various schools of the tradition that, in a sense, build up to the particular tradition that we find ourselves in. So this is an exciting project because by learning about things like Kala or Rodha Shakti or the tattvas or the principles of Shiva and these things, that these words that are so familiar to us now, understanding their roots in the tradition can help us appreciate them more as they are uniquely articulated in our particular lineage. So these words like Kala and Vidya and the 36 tattvas and Mala, especially the word Mala, which is a hotly contested concept in this tradition. Mala meaning impurity. To what extent is that actual? Does it have any reality whatsoever, or is it merely illusory? Like, these are deep debates to be had, actually, and these debates have been had over the course of hundreds and hundreds of years. And so those terms, which we might so casually be acquainted with, like tattva or Shiva, even a term like Shiva, is something that's been redefined and reassessed and revisited over the course of many hundreds of years. And so each time we come to that word, we should come to it with perhaps the deepest appreciation possible, which I argue is engendered by coming to know the diverse ways in which that term is used. Secondly, the terms are almost in some sense cumulative. So without understanding what came before, not only will we not have an appreciation for the term or for the concept or for the practice as it appears to us now at this stage of our spirituality, but also we might not even have the prerequisite understanding or the prerequisite realization to necessarily benefit from the concept or from the practice or from the term. So in a sense, it's also a graded approach. By learning all these prerequisite, I don't want to call them prerequisites, but let's say prior traditions, at least chronologically or historically in some cases. In not all cases, by the way. Some of these traditions which we're studying today come after Shaiva monism, Shaiva non-duality. So it's not quite true to say that these are all presented in a chronological sequence, but insofar as they are, studying the tradition and tracing it from its roots all the way to where we are now is meaningful because it ensures that we cover the bases and that we have the prerequisite knowledge and understanding which those people who inherited this tradition in the first place would have had, because they existed in a context somewhat different from ours, and trying to contextualize ourselves in that context, to what extent that's possible given our various cultural limitations, at least ideologically, at least if nothing else, academically, might be quite helpful actually in orienting us to our own tradition. Not only will we appreciate it more, but we might come to understand it better. And thirdly, most importantly, it gives us, I think, not only the appreciation and understanding, but also the realization. And to make this point, I've last week implied that these traditions are sort of stacked on top of one another. Not necessarily, that's not necessarily the only way to look at things. But at least in the life of Sri Ramakrishna, it seems that deeper, I don't even call them deeper, but more non-dual, more goddess-oriented realizations follow closely on the heels of, or are rather premised upon, prior realizations. And it's those prior realizations that I want to talk about insofar as we're interested in practicing Tantra, at least the kind of Tantra we're practicing, the very advanced, subtle, esoteric form of Kali Puja. The Tantra is oriented around Kali, which is very advanced Shaivism actually. Insofar as we're interested in practicing that form of spirituality, it's good to get our firm footing. And so this is sort of a foundations first series. And so we're exploring a Vedic lifestyle. What does it mean to be a Vaidika? What does it mean to live according to the injunctions of the Vedas? And having done that, we can then explore what it means to transgress those very injunctions, which for the most part, were helpful to spirituality, which can eventually sooner or later become obstacles to spirituality. But there's no sense in trying to transgress something that we haven't first established. And so that's typically what ends up happening. We argued last week. Everyone wants Kali, but they forget that Kali is standing on Shiva. That's another thing. So to get Kali without Shiva, in a sense, is to get energy without containment, without ground. Not to say that they are separate, mind you. They're not two parts of a whole. That's by no means what I'm implying. They're two aspects of one reality, or in other words, a better way, a more refined way of saying it would be as follows. There are two ways of looking at the same thing. For instance, the word gata in Sanskrit and the word kumbha in Sanskrit are synonyms. They both refer to the same entity, namely a pot. In just that same way, Shiva and Shakti refer to the same reality. However, there's a nuance. Shakti is one particular reading and Shiva is another particular reading of the same thing. But to read it one way and ignore the other reading might be partial and not as wholesome as we can have. So therefore, many want Shakti without Shiva. And that can lead to maybe some ungrounded tantra, if you will. And then many want Shiva without Shakti, which is just as bad, if not worse, because that leads to a lifeless, powerless, meaningless tantra. Shiva without Shakti, what is that? We often argue that Shiva without Icha here stands for Shakti, is just Shava. In the Sanskrit, Shiva without his E, without Kali, becomes Shava, and Shava just means corpse. So Shiva without his Shakti is just a corpse. But Shakti without her Shiva is energy without ground. So Bhairava or Shiva and Shakti, they're two readings of one and the same reality, and understanding them together will be most wholesome. And now many people want Shiva without stepping on the goblin. So when we look at Shiva in his Nataraja form, we find that Shiva is also stepping on something. He's stepping on the trampled ego, the forces of delusion, the goblin. So you can't have Shiva without trampling on the goblin, and you can't have Shakti without trampling on Shiva. So in a sense, the very images of Nataraja and Kali give you a sort of doxographical hierarchy, if I may be permitted to use that term. The idea that the various schools of Tantra or Shaivism, the various modes of spiritual understanding, stack on top of one another like a house of cards. And if you pull out the bottom card, the whole thing comes tumbling down. So usually what happens is we try to build a superstructure from the top. It's as if we're trying to stack cards on a non-existent base. But if we attend to the foundations first, and any good Hatha yoga teacher will tell you this, that you have to go feet first in any yoga posture. If you try to address the balance in the head or in the shoulders, you'll fall over. Because until you have firm footing, one should not attempt a balancing posture. Similarly, we should build our house of cards from the bottom up, starting with the foundation. I want to present these various schools and various modes of understanding as that kind of cumulative approach, or that kind of sequential, dare I say, hierarchical approach. That's my project. Mostly I want to explore richness and diversity of the tradition to make the case that there are so many different ways of looking at the same thing, and they're all so wonderful. And you know what? I like the House of Cards and how fragile it sounds because, and Yashodhara has pointed this out, the House of Cards sounds pretty fragile, right? Like I was saying last week, that is the sense that one gets when they are practicing spirituality. The Katha Upanishad was the first to say it. It's like walking on a razor's edge. It's not only unsteady and delicate, it's also quite fraught because one false step and the leg can be cut. And I was telling you about the sword dancers last week, that in India, actually, some people, they're by trade sword dancers. So there's this long sword, and somebody holds one end, another person holds the other. So two people are holding the swords on either end, and a person or two people or three people, depending on what kind of act it is, will dance on the edge of a sword, and they're having so much fun with it. For them, it's nothing. They've mastered the art of dancing on swords. But for those of us who are learning the art, we're struck by the delicacy and subtlety of it, and also, in some sense, the danger of it. That's the sense that one gets anyway when practicing spirituality and when engaging in spiritual life. So it's called walking on a razor's edge. Then, in the Kaula literature, in the literature of non-dual Tantra, or I shouldn't say non-dual Tantra necessarily, but goddess-oriented transgressive Tantra, there, that Katha Upanishad metaphor of walking on the razor's edge is um, improved upon, if you will. It's argued that it would be easier to dance on the edge of a sword or wrestle a tiger, or I think that it's in plural, wrestle tigers, than it would be to practice the Kaula Marga. In other words, it would be easier to do those things, which are already so dangerous, so fraught, than it would be to practice the Kaula Marga. And that's an important point because the Kaula Marga, the path of, I don't want to call it the left hand because that also comes with a bunch of connotations that don't necessarily apply here. But the Kaula Marga, this form of radical transgressive Tantra, has unique challenges. Challenges that are especially true of it that are maybe not found in other spiritual paths. But in other spiritual paths, there are also challenges. Like spiritual life in general is quite challenging. And to speak to that, I think these metaphors are offered. So, yes, the House of Cards, it's a beautiful project to build this House of Cards. And it's also quite delicate. And it takes a lot of care and a lot of tact. Of course, all of this is only relatively speaking. Absolutely speaking, we are perfectly safe. Absolutely speaking, the body, the mind, are nothing but the Divine Mother, and she's only taking care of that. So the question is, on what level do we want to speak? If I mean the absolute level truths are always very comforting, and we should always take refuge in them. So when we give a lecture from that point of view, we stress Advaita, non-duality. We stress the perfect, if you will, safety of the universe as being nothing but the Divine Mother through and through. Ultimately, who is realizing what? Who is practicing? Who is holding the sword? Who is dancing on it? Who is wrestling the tiger and who is the tiger being wrestled? Ultimately, it's all Ma, and it's her all-pervasive will through and through that does everything spontaneously in its own time. So I can't even practice spirituality. It happens. It's something that the body and mind naturally does, as naturally as a lotus flower will open when kissed by the first rays of the rising sun. You see, when we come into the absolute truth, one becomes inspired, and then speech becomes articulate and poetic, and everything resounds as absolutely and ultimately true. But the beauty of Indian spirituality is the teachers of this tradition have always been able to speak on both levels. They can wax lyrical and spontaneously compose enchanting poetry about the absolute nature of the Divine Mother, the non-duality by which she manifests all of this. And at the same time, they can take one step down, as it were, though I don't like to put it on a hierarchy in this way, and speak to us in very lucid and practical terms that pertain to our felt sense of being this particular body and mind, and engaging in a particular pursuit of attaining that which is the highest, that which nothing higher can be attained, which is the ultimate joy and the permanent cessation of all suffering. So acknowledging that everything absolutely is okay, but acknowledging also that it doesn't always feel that way and that spiritual life is a practice that goes from point A to point B, if you will, is the joy of our tradition. So whenever one becomes too much, you can take refuge in the other. If you spend too much time in the Paramartha, in the absolute, it becomes impractical. Because then when it comes to your day-to-day lived experience, you find that for all this philosophy, it doesn't feel tangibly true. I'm still getting upset. I'm still afraid. I'm still questing after limited sensory transient pleasures. Why don't I feel the perennial bliss of my own being? After all, absolutely speaking, I am consciousness, reposing in my own innate fullness, endowed with the powers of willing, knowing, and doing. Why doesn't that feel true all of the time? I still feel like this particular body, this particular mind, and I still feel oppressed, whether real or actual. Sorry, whether actual or illusory, I still feel oppressed by bondage, by my own limitations. How can I account for that? And so I just have to sign up for another Rupert Spire like workshop or something. Like I just have to keep going to YouTube and keep ingesting Advaita, which is good actually. That's still valuable. But often you can come away from that being very frustrated because all you hear is absolute truth. You're like, but I'm suffering. And then a non-dual teacher will say, who is suffering? Look carefully. Is your suffering not an experience that arises in you? And you're holding the microphone at the front of the hall and everyone's really quiet and the non-dual teacher is drinking clear water as a sign of how clear their mind is, and they speak very slowly and they look at you very intently. I'm not doubting that they've had that experience, but I'm doubting their ability to transmit it. And more importantly, I'm doubting their ability to transmit it in a sustainable way. Because even if in that moment the person gets that clear water transmission and they're like, oh, you're right, this body that suffers, this mind that's grieving, it's but an object arising in me. And ultimately, all objects have no difference aside from me, like all of that, right? Give it till the parking lot. And as you're driving out of the hotel, having paid hundreds of dollars for your Advaita retreat, in which nothing was removed from you and nothing was added onto you, and still you were charged. Anyway, that's for another night. But as you're pulling out of the parking lot, having gained nothing, having lost nothing except maybe a couple $100, as you're pulling out, immediately somebody cuts you off on the freeway and gone. The Advaita is gone. It's good. It's all true. Everything that you heard was true. And so the soul sings. Truth has a particular quality to it. Once it's heard, it has an ennobling effect. And so it should be heard and heard again and again and again and reviewed and refreshed. That's all very good. But also importantly, having heard the ultimate truth, then we must also ask the question, how can I act in such a way that that truth is unobscured? And then comes the question of practice. There are certain impediments, it seems like, real or imagined, that prevent me from cashing in on this joy that I just for a few $100 heard was mine. What are those impediments? And then so spiritual life becomes a psychological and a physical project. Up to this point, the lecture on the absolute truth was purely spiritual in nature. It doesn't actually necessarily address psychology or physicality. It doesn't necessarily address relative life. And often in many cases, it rejects it as being real at all. So it almost feels to me that in some of these traditions, and again, I don't mean this as a critique, but it's going to come off as a critique, unfortunately. It's absolutely true what they're saying, right? But my problem is that in some cases, I fear that it's stepping away from the responsibility of actually seeing that manifest in a student by claiming that there are no problems to be solved at all, on the basis of absolute Advaita, on the basis of Brahman alone is real, the world is a dream. On that basis, we say you don't have to work out anything on the level of the body and mind. And that's true in one sense, but in another sense, it's not that helpful. Relatively speaking, practically speaking, it's a statement delivered from the peak of the mountain. But it's not necessarily a statement that can be used meaningfully by a person at the base, except as inspiration and except as motivation. For that person at the base, one foot forward in front of the other kind of advice might be required. So therefore, we come down a bit, so to speak, to the realm of the practical. And now we have to speak not spiritually necessarily, but psychologically and physically. And where it comes to the body, and especially where it comes to the mind, we're dealing with a very rare beast, a very delicate animal. And it's very fraught because it's very prone to delusion. The mind is very quick to take a good thing and then use it to further increase our attachment to the limited. So spirituality, which can be used to free oneself, to disentangle oneself from all the limitations of life, those very tools can then be used to reinforce those limitations which they are designed to overcome. And we see it every day. When we're not careful about spiritual life, then spirituality itself can be a cause for great suffering. And that care, that discernment, necessarily requires that we refine our intellect, that we refine our intuition, and that we operate the system of the body and mind in a very skillful way. So once we start talking about skillful means, then the metaphors of the house of cards, or the dancing on the edge of a sword, or walking on a razor's edge, or wrestling tigers, all of that suddenly makes sense, and it becomes thrilling actually. It becomes exciting because we understand the work that is ahead of us is delicate, but it's also beautiful. It's a delicate art, after all, to wrestle tigers, like the tarot card, the 8 card in the major arcana. She subdued the tiger, but with great care, with great tact. Or it's a lion in that case. And then dancing on the edge of a sword, it can be a beautiful thing, a beautiful expression of freedom, but it must be done carefully. And walking on a razor's edge can also be done, but carefully. So building a house of cards, it's aesthetically why that it's done out of an aesthetic purpose. And still it's a delicate process. So we should acknowledge that the body and mind is quite delicate, and Tantra, the technologies of Tantra, address us on every level, including the physical and psychological. So a lot of the understandings, the philosophies of Tantra, but most importantly, a lot of the practices of Tantra are very psychological in nature, down to the things that we visualize and the mantras that we repeat. They have a physiological and a psycho-physiological effect. And all of that's quite delicate, right? Because the infrastructure with which we're working is quite delicate. So it's subtle. And having said all of that, it's also exciting. Now, the Christ put it in a very nice way. He said, "My yoke is easy and my burden light." So, as hard as it might be to practice spirituality, in a sense, it's a bit harder just to be in the world. So, the Christ's argument is that this is delicate, it's difficult, it's fraught, but not quite as difficult and fraught as just like living a regular life trying to find infinite joy and finite pleasures. It's difficult, but comparatively it's easier than just like being a worldling or whatever. So the Christ is like, "Come to me, all ye who labor and who are heavy laden, and I will give ye rest." So ultimately we have to make this claim. Whether or not we're doing spiritual life skillfully, most of the time, the very fact that we're doing spiritual life is inherently rewarding. Puja, whether skillfully done or not, is inherently rewarding. It's beautiful, inherently. And meditation is inherently rewarding. All of these things that we might do in the name of spirituality, japa, meditation, japa meaning the repetition of mantras, puja, the symbolic form of ritual worship, all of that, just by engaging in these practices, our life becomes better. Heck, just by thinking the thoughts that we're going to think tonight, our evening arguably is made meaningfully better. I hope, if I can do my job at least, if I can eventually get to the lecture. It takes me so long to actually get started, but if I can eventually get to the lecture, the very things that we're going to discuss are quite stimulating and quite interesting, and that itself is inherently valuable, irrespective of what we choose to do with this information. Whether or not we apply it or realize it or integrate it, maybe is even beside the point. The very fact that we get to hear it and think about it and enjoy it, that itself is meaningful. Just to think cool thoughts, we shouldn't underestimate the joy of that. In this world, it can be so boring and so tired if we didn't have new ideas to think about. Just as ideas, these can be quite interesting and stimulating. There's a kind of bhoga to it, a kind of enjoyment that you can have in the realm of the intellect, thinking of these incredibly refined intellectual ideas. And there's a kind of aesthetic joy, another kind of bhoga you can have just from participating in puja and japa and thinking about Kali, how beautiful she is, just artistically speaking, and how beautiful she is intellectually speaking as an idea, as a concept, and how wonderful it is to have a relationship to that divine source of all things. That itself is inherently rewarding. So, irrespective of skillful means or not, whether or not we actually succeed in spiritual life, whatever that means and whatever that looks like, participating in it is itself inherently wonderful. And it's so joyous just to be in spiritual life that Christ, he was able to say, "Well, choose me. My yoke is easy and my burden is light." But he was clear, it was still a burden. It's still a yoke. It's still something that can be difficult from time to time, but not as heavy and not as restraining as just regular life in the world. "Come to me, all ye who are heavily laden and belabored, and I shall give ye rest." That promise is still true with regards to every kind of spiritual tradition. We take refuge, as it were, in spirituality. But also, I think another thing that's really nice about spirituality is taking refuge in the kind of community that genuine spirituality engenders. Because in a truly spiritual place, there's no give or take necessarily, there is only give. That's my intuition. In a genuine spiritual place, there's no real conversation about payment of any kind. And there's no conversation about reciprocated love even. It's just love given freely to one and all, because the nature of God is love. So in a spiritual community, in a genuine spiritual community where the power in that community is coming from God, it's a vibration of love and joy, and it's almost like for the first time we can be loved for something other than our body, other than our mind, other than our material possessions. We can be loved as only children know how to love and be loved. Like that. There's a sweetness and an innocence to a genuine spiritual community. Of course, community itself is fraught because the moment people come together for any reason, drama will abound, no matter what. That's just the nature of collectivizing, like religion is just people doing spirituality together. And we all know how problematic religion can be. So that being said, these things are also delicate. The way we come together in community is a very delicate thing. And that's very important to point out. And we should be careful also, because we can't always assume that everyone in community is like there for the same reason or on the same vibration. We can't even be sure of our own reason. Like that's my claim here, is that spirituality is fraught because coming together with people is fraught. But what makes that fraught is because the body and mind is inherently fraught. It's nobody's fault. And it's not even the body and mind's fault. It's the joy and the thrill of spiritual life that these things are delicate. Anyway, having said all of that, the question then arises, how can I do this in a way that like maximizes the beauty and meaning and joy of it, but in a way that best protects me from the, sometimes, not to say inevitable, but inbuilt risks and dangers. These things just come with the territory, of course. So how can I sensibly protect myself from all of that while at the same time going deeper in those aspects of spirituality that are truly meaningful and truly enriching? So really the question that we've asked last week and this week is, how can we practice in a way that's safe, grounded, and meaningful and enriching? How can we approach Kali in the most sanctified of ways? That's the question we're asking. And we're trying to answer it with an appeal to the wider tradition. Now, before I continue, I want to make a brief point here. So sometimes when I'm discussing things with people, hello Jess, Jaima, when I'm discussing things with people, I find sometimes a fear of course, not with you. Most of you in this room delight in, but some people have a fear of, dare I say it, thinking through stuff. It's like a fear that logic or analysis or the intellect somehow demeans the sanctity of a thing. So, a fear of philosophy, a fear of reasoning, a fear of intellectual engagement with something. And usually this is expressed as a glorification of intuition. So many people will tell me, I prefer to feel into things intuitively. I don't like to think about them. I don't like to explore things intellectually. I just feel when something is right or when something is wrong. So now, in response to this, I usually say the word in Sanskrit for both intuition and intellect is the same. It's buddhi, or even pratibha. Pratibha might be a word that implies intuition a bit more directly. But buddhi, it's the same root as in buddha. One who is awakened is one whose buddhi is the most refined it can be. Meaning it involves an imaginative faculty, an intuitive faculty, an affective, emotional faculty allied to an intellectual faculty. So in the West, because of maybe Descartes and this Cartesian duality between body and mind, we tend to think of reasoning as somehow disembodied. Dantadasji, that's a beautiful way of putting it. So logic can be very disembodied because Aristotelian syllogisms, or like pure logic, which is pure mathematics, is usually not grounded in experience. It's entirely theoretical. And so mathematics, logic, that kind of reasoning is probably not what we have in mind. It's valuable, no doubt. That stuff is good and it's very powerful. Our Western liberal democracies are powered by that kind of reasoning, theoretical, mathematical, analytical reasoning. So that idea that we can predict where Halley's Comet is based on some mathematical model, that's all true and that's all well and good, but that's not quite the reasoning that we're speaking about here. This reasoning is a deeply embodied reasoning. It takes the advantage of all the analytical and intellectual faculties, but it allies it to, as Dantadasji is pointing out, experience, not necessarily just experience from this life, but experience from previous lives, and also something even deeper than experience. And that deeper thing can be called pratibha, intuition. But again, on the topic of Shiva and Shakti, we can think of it as, yeah, vijnanam, vijnana, thought and intuition. We can think of it as these two things, analysis and intuition. These two things are not two, actually. Again, on that same line of thinking as we started the lecture with, Shiva and Shakti are two ways of looking at the same thing. So, intellect is another way of saying intuition, and intuition is another way of saying intellect. However, the thing about intuition that I have to point out is that in most cases, it's just a knee jerk conditioned response to things. It doesn't necessarily have to be a deep felt sense of truth. It could just be your own conditioned aversion to things that are actually good for you and your own indulgent hankering after things that are not good for you but feel safe because of your conditioning. Do not be so sure that intuition is really divine. It's like they say, the devil speaks scriptures too. How do you know in any given instant that this isn't just some repressed conditioning making a decision for you? How do you know that it's really some deep embodied voice of truth? So, if we're going to evaluate something based on the way that it makes us feel, we have to ask ourselves, as Sai is rightly pointing out, is it intuition or projection? Am I feeling rightly in this case? Because in many instances, if I've suffered some kind of trauma, and who is there who hasn't, of course, to varying degrees, but even that is subjective, then when we come into a situation that superficially even resembles that thing which triggered the trauma in the first place, immediately we'll get a gut feeling. And that's good because it's trying to protect us from that experience. However, that might not be judging the experience rightly. In most cases, it's better to be safe than sorry. So this gut feeling that protects us from harm, that should always be honored. But I'm not so sure that it's the most reliable tool when it comes to evaluating spiritual philosophies or spiritual ideas. It's a wonderful tool when it comes to evaluating other people, make no mistake, or communities. I mean, then that kind of trauma response can be helpful, actually. Even if it's wholly off the mark, even if it's a projection or a misplaced misjudgment, even then it's in many cases better to be safe than sorry anyway. And so that feeling which errs on the side of safety comes up strongly and it should be honored, no doubt. But I am cautious about its efficacy when it comes to gauging sadhana, spiritual practice, and also spiritual philosophies. Because oftentimes the raw feeling that we get from something is good, it's valuable, it's meaningful, it's part of the process, but it's not the whole picture. And so too is the intellectual argument not the whole picture. The two must come together. So I'm not making a case for one over the other. I'm saying that we should use all the tools. And I think, Ruth, you've clarified it beautifully. Wisdom as opposed to knowledge, or buddhi, discernment as opposed to analytical, logical reasoning. Something could be reasonable and still not true. And yet something might not feel good or true, and yet it might be, you know. And the way to kind of navigate between the cost benefit analysis here is to use both. So one thing I have to point out is that in Indian spirituality, we've never had to sacrifice one for the other. We've always somehow, throughout the centuries, had both. You can call that intuition, that raw inspiration feeling, religion or spirituality. It appeals to something that's maybe prior to the mind, something that you can argue is like non cognitive or non discursive, and yet very tangible and very meaningful. It feels very deep. That we can call a religious instinct or a spiritual instinct. And then there's philosophy, which is the articulation of that with language, using language to its most refined capacity, and also importantly, it uses the intellect and tools of discernment. As such, the word buddhi is quite comprehensive. It implies imagination, intuition, it implies judgment and discernment, not necessarily evaluation, doesn't necessarily assign a feeling of goodness or badness to something, but it does judge and it does evaluate, I should say. And most importantly, I think it discerns, it reasons things through. So if one rejects the role of reason in favor of intuition, that's good but not great. Similarly, if one rejects intuition, which would be terrible, in favor of reason, again, that's good but not great. These are two aspects of one and the same thing. So it's good to use both. So part of our project when we study these philosophies is that just all spiritual goals aside, just studying them itself helps us refine our intellect. thinking through these ideas that test the limits of language, that require great subtlety and tact to discuss and think about and handle, that itself is an inherently rewarding process. Remember, Swami Vivekananda didn't like mathematics. He was not given to mathematics. And Sri Ramakrishna, who many people, me included, believe to be God himself, really struggled in math class. He didn't like math at all. He was an artist. But again, these people were very refined intellects. I think that should prove a very important point. Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda had very refined intellects, but they didn't very much go in for mathematics or formal logic or anything like that. This is a different kind of intellect which we're talking about. That's why whenever you see a religious idea expressed in India, it's almost immediately allied to a philosophical system. So you can't separate, maybe this is the first point we should make tonight, you can't separate philosophy from religion. The moment a religious inspiration arises, immediately in India, we do our best to articulate it along philosophical lines. We engage the intellect in the process of unpacking that religious inspiration in order to not only preserve it, systematize it, but more importantly, to transmit it. Because it's through language, really, that religious inspiration can be transmitted. Not always, sometimes a glance, sometimes a touch, sometimes the mere presence of an awakened being is enough to enact this transmission, this sankramana, or the Shakti Pata, to use another phrase. But in most cases, it's usually some kind of teaching which comes in a verbal form, some kind of linguistic, conceptual content that comes as a carrier for that transmission. So being able to articulate in a very refined and sensible way that religious inspiration has always been the grand project of Indian spirituality. And so each school of philosophy is premised upon a religious revelation, but it's this earnest and honest attempt to use the total faculties of reasoning and language to articulate that religious realization. As such, all the schools of Indian philosophy are rightly called darshanas. Darshanas mean ways of seeing or paths of realization, if you will. So each darshana is like a path, and if you follow it to its conclusion in both theory and practice, you will have the realization, the direct experience of reality from which that teaching came. So that teaching itself is rooted in reality. As such, it can be called a darshana. So everything we're studying, it's not mere philosophy. It's philosophy rooted in a spiritual experience. And this brings me to my second point. Why then are there so many philosophies? And Jess is asking a beautiful question. Is it intuition or reason or both? Is it always a choice? It feels like a choice if they're being articulated as two separate things, like there's Shakti and there's Shiva, or there's intuition and there's reason. Which one should I choose? Again, these are two ways of looking at the same thing. So I think both is the better route. To say, I have an inspiration. Now can I justify this reasonably? Can I discern this intellectually? So you test it. Does it stand up to reason? And if it stands up to reason, does it actually lead me to a direct experience of reality? Like that, the two actually are two aspects of one, two readings of the same reality. So that being said, the word buddhi to imply both imagination and intellection, to imply both intuition and discernment is helpful. Because by thinking of it as one word, we don't think of it as a choice or two separate processes that I have to use at different times. I should never think of Shiva and Shakti as two different things. And similarly, I should never think of all these philosophies as separate things. They're all just various, very valid readings of one thing. So that being said, if we say that all spiritual philosophies, all darshanas, are rooted in reality, why are they all different in articulation? In other words, if reality is one, then why are all the philosophies which describe reality so diverse? In other words, if everyone's experienced that same reality directly, why then do they all have something different to say about it? It's a very valid question, actually. And one way to answer this is called religious exclusivism, which is what we talked about before the satsang. I have to confess, friends, often we have our pre-satsang, and I should be doing arti and singing songs, but today the sun hadn't yet set, and I was somewhat reluctant to do arti before the sun set, just out of habit. So we were waiting. It's now the springtime. So we're waiting, daylight savings and all. We're waiting for the sun to set. Then the sun set. But in the time when we were waiting for the sun to set, I think I accidentally gave the whole lecture. So those of you who were here in that hour before the lecture, I'm going to repeat a few concepts, and I hope you don't mind. Those of you just coming, You're lucky. You don't have to hear this twice. Or unlucky, I don't know, maybe it's helpful to hear it twice. But anyway, there are a few different ways to approach this question. If reality is one, if it's reality, and if every school of philosophy is rooted in that reality, why are all the schools of philosophy so different from one another? Why are all the articulations so different? How do you answer this? And you can answer it in three different ways. The first answer is called religious exclusivism. Only one of them is right and everything else is wrong. The only way you can account for the fact that there is one ultimate reality and that there are many different ways of describing it is by saying that one way of describing it is the right way and all the other ways of describing it are misaligned. So the rest of the ways are not rooted in reality. They are confused ramblings of people who think they're rooted in reality but aren't. But our tradition is uniquely rooted in reality. So none can come to the Father except by the way of the Son. And by the Son, we mean this particular formulation of Jesus Christ. There are 45,000 sects of Christianity, but our particular sect is the right one. And so you can only attain reality, the Father. You can only attain salvation, the kingdom of heaven, if you accept this particular Christ, because he is the way, the truth, and the life. And by that we mean our interpretation of him is the way, the truth, and the life. This is how most of us are when it comes to religion. In order to solve the problem of pluralistic views, we resort to religious exclusivism by saying our claim alone is right and all the other claims are wrong. So problem solved. There's only one reality and only one correct reading of it. That's the first attempt to answer this question. The second attempt is called religious inclusivism. It's slightly more capacious, but again, it's not great either. So the second view is that, see, there is one ultimate reality, and our description of it is the most correct because it's the most aligned and most rooted in reality. But reality has many levels, from the deepest to the most superficial. And the other schools of philosophy, they're also right, each according to their own level of reality. So because reality is so deep and because it's hierarchical, there's like the deepest, bye Natalie Jaima, there's the deepest and the most superficial, then no problem. Every other school of philosophy fits in, but on a lower level. So if you follow this path, it will only take you so far, and then you graduate to another path. And if you follow that path, again, it will only take you so far, and then you'll graduate to a third path. And by following that path, you'll get to a fourth path, and a fifth path, and a sixth path. And eventually, sooner or later, in this life or in some life, as you make your innumerable rounds around this wheel of birth and death, eventually you'll come to this understanding because this is the best understanding. So this is called doxographical hierarchy or a hierarchicalist view of religion where our teaching is the best teaching, but that doesn't mean the other teachings are wrong. This is how Achintya Bheda of Gaudiya Vaishnavism works, for instance. They argue that Krishna is the ultimate divine form, and it's not that Vishnu is not true, it's just a lesser manifestation of Krishna. That's what the Gaudiya Vaishnavas will argue. That Krishna is a more refined, more absolute, more ultimate form of Vishnu. Vishnu is a little bit removed from the ultimate nature of reality. Still true though, after all, Krishna is an avatar of Vishnu, no? But the argument here that they make in Gaudiya Vaishnavism is brilliant. They argue that no, not quite. Krishna is a spiritual principle that goes beyond even the doctrine of the avatar. He is the ultimate nature of reality, and he is always sporting in Goloka with his Hladini Shakti, with Radharani and all the gopis and whatnot. This is a much higher, much more absolute order of reality than Vishnu in Vaikuntha or much higher than the non-dual nirguna aspect. Now, the Chaitanya people, the Achintya Bheda people, they accept the nirguna aspect, but they consider it a lower manifestation compared to the saguna, sakara aspect of Sri Krishna. So again, this is inclusivist because it doesn't reject other schools as outright wrong, but it brings them into a kind of hierarchy that leverages their school, whichever it may be, as the pinnacle of that hierarchy. So as one master once said, you could say first it's Dvaita, dualistic philosophy. Then it's qualified non-dualistic philosophy. Then ultimately it's Advaita. So Advaita must be the highest and duality must be the lowest. And then one master said, you know that, and it's like a ladder, right? If you want to get to the roof, you have a ladder. You start with the lowest rung, Dvaita. Then you go to Dvaita, qualified non-duality. Then you go to Advaita proper, and then you get to the roof. So Advaita is the highest rung of the ladder. So imagine these philosophies are like rungs of a ladder. And then one master said, a ladder can be used both ways, right? So even if you establish a hierarchy and you say it's like a ladder, can't I just flip the ladder? depending on what I consider to be the highest. So that's what many schools of philosophy will do. So Ramanuja, for instance, he accepts that Jnana Yoga and Karma Yoga are very important spiritual practices, but they're not as important as Bhakti Yoga. Bhakti Yoga is the best spiritual practice, the one and only spiritual practice for attaining the highest. At best, Karma Yoga and Jnana Yoga can prepare you for Bhakti Yoga. So philosophy and ritual can prepare you for the real practice of loving God. But it's only through loving God that you can attain Him. That's Ramanuja's view. Shankara laughs at that. He says it's completely the opposite. Bhakti Yoga can purify your heart. Loving God prepares you for a much higher practice called knowing God, Jnana. Because ultimately in Jnana, you realize that there is no God, there is no you, there is no world. There is only one undivided reality. And it's formless and impersonal. And you realize that through jnana, not through bhakti. It's not through loving it that you realize it, but through knowing it that you become it. As the Mundaka Upanishad says, Brahma Veda Brahmeva Bhavati. By knowing Brahman, one becomes Brahman. It doesn't say by loving Brahman, one becomes Brahman. It says by knowing Brahman. And because it says that, Shankara will argue that Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, the path of philosophy, inquiry, is much higher than the path of love. But that isn't to say you can't get somewhere with loving God. So see, this is the inclusivist view. It argues that there are better and worse yogas, but no yoga, no spiritual path is completely useless. Karma, ritualism, or action will prepare you for bhakti, and bhakti will prepare you for jnana, and jnana will free you. Or, if you're Ramanuja, flip the script. Jnana will prepare you for karma, and karma will prepare you for bhakti, and bhakti will lead you to God. So like that, you can use the ladder in both ways. So the ladder, the idea of religious inclusivism, can be applied to not just schools of philosophy, but also modes of practice. And as Shivanima is pointing out here, it can be applied also to, actually no, Shivanima is making a different point here, but it can also be applied to the capacity of the practitioners. So the Manda, meaning the weak practitioners, will have to do this path. And the Madhya, the middle practitioners, will do this path. And the Uttama, the supreme practitioners, will do this path. So you can also stratify these schools based on their teachings, based on their practices, and based on their practitioners. And so each school, of course, will privilege their particular group and their particular method and their particular philosophy as the highest in this religious inclusivism model. So many people, of course, project religious inclusivism onto Sri Ramakrishna. So they argue that like, oh, well, see, Sri Ramakrishna and his life demonstrates the logical sequence of religion from duality to qualified non-duality and finally to non-duality. So it's almost as if from Sri Ramakrishna's life, we get the impression that you start with duality, feeling that you're different from God. Then through spiritual practice and through subsequent realizations, you realize that actually you're not different from God. That only seemed to be true because you were far from God. When you got a little closer, you realized you were a part of God. Not identical with God, per se, but part of God, participating in God's wholeness. Before, I thought I was the servant and you were the master. Now, I know better, and I feel that I am the part and you are the whole. Doesn't this sound a bit like an improvement? Because I've gotten closer to God in one sense, because now I'm participating in God more directly. Then you could say, and one step further is to realize I am God. Or God, rather, like, not to say God is me, but I'm subsumed wholly in God and there's no difference between me and God anymore. It's like the fire turns the moth into itself. And gone is Nish, God alone remains. So much so that I can say, Chidananda Rupa, Shivoham, Shivoham. Doesn't that sound like the highest realization? Not necessarily. Many people project this kind of religious inclusivism onto Sri Ramakrishna. They say that, oh, like Hanuman said, Deho bhava das asmi. I feel like your servant whenever I consider myself to be a body. But when I consider myself to be a jiva, then I feel your nature to be the whole and I feel myself to be a part. And when I know who I am, in other words, when I feel myself to be consciousness, this is often misquoted, but when he says, when I feel myself to be consciousness, then you and I are one. Which is the best? And some will say, obviously, the last one is the best, because that's when Hanuman is most self-knowing. It's when he's clear about his true nature. It's when he's in delusion that he acts like the servant of God. But we forget to note that Hanuman preferred to be the servant of God. For he could be in any of these three states, but he spent much of his time being Rama's servant. That seemed to him to be the most enjoyable and most meaningful. So for Hanuman, he might say they're all nice, but I like to be the servant of God. This is closer to Sri Ramakrishna's mood in that he felt that they were all equally valid and all equally enjoyable. You don't have to say that any one is higher or lower than the other. So this third view is called religious pluralism. And religious pluralism is the view that the reason why there are many different interpretations of the one reality has to do with the nature of that reality itself. Reality is infinitely capacious, not in a hierarchical way, in a perfectly equivalent way. Like all the various experiences of reality are all variously equally valid ways of experiencing the same thing. So it's the nature of reality that makes it so infinitely varied that it ultimately comes down to this: which way we're looking at the thing. That's it. It's not to say one way is better and the other ways are wrong. It's not to say that one way is ultimate and the other ways lead up to it. No, they're all equally ultimate in that they all equally reveal the same reality. But because that reality is so capacious, so infinite in nature, each school reveals a different aspect of that reality, which isn't to say the reality has parts. That's not what we're arguing at all. We're not saying the ultimate nature of reality has this part or that part, and different schools of philosophy are each of them leading to this part or that part. That's not the claim. Instead, what we're saying is that reality is such that it can be read differently from different points of view, owing to the perspective and also taste of each individual practitioner. Right. So anyway, there's a discussion here. Okay, and this is a good discussion. We should take it into the Q&A because it's, I think, a controversial and importantly controversial point. The schism that we feel between intuition and reasoning. The reason I bring it up, though, is because I want to make a case for reasoning. Because a lot of the work that we're participating in now requires subtle reasoning, subtle inquiry, and philosophy. So if we just go based on how things make us feel, that's good but not great. And if we just go based off of logic and analysis, again, that's good but not great. It's better that we use both. So when we present all these different schools of philosophy, we evaluate them based on the intellect but also on the intuition. In other words, we employ the buddhi. It's to the buddhi, the imaginative intellect, or the intuitive reasoning faculty. I'm going to call it that from now on. It's to that that these philosophies are being presented. And it's that that must interact with them and appreciate them and ultimately decide to either reject them or incorporate them. That's the exciting thing. So we're going on a bit of a tour and presenting different schools of philosophy. And like I said last week, the exciting thing about this project is we can map these various schools of philosophy in relation to one another as a sort of not necessarily chronological sequence, though I often present it in that way, but a sort of logical sequence. But again, I want to go even beyond that. The purpose of my whole preamble today is to make a case for a pluralistic reading of all of these various schools of philosophy that I'm going to talk about. See, usually, you know what happens when you come to, usually a spiritual teacher will speak from only one point of view. And that's great because that's the view that they attain their realization in, arguably. That's the tradition that they belong to. So you get a particular flavor from that particular teacher. And so in our community, it tends to be out and out Advaita. So throughout all of the lectures, there's a strong emphasis on Advaita, 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 and importantly, Tantric Advaita. So Kali and Advaita, this is kind of our home base, if you will. But it's also my project, because we're in the lineage of Sri Ramakrishna, to recognize that there's not just one way of looking at things. And one of the best ways to enjoy reality is to look at it from different angles. You know, there are people who love heavy metal, and then there are people who love music. And arguably, you can't say the person who enjoys music as heavy metal is wrong. Absolutely not. Like, that's just their favorite form of music. And that's the only kind of music that they'll listen to. And they'll probably put it in their Instagram bio that they love heavy metal, but they hate country. Because everybody hates country, except those who don't hate country. And those who somehow have found a way to combine those two genres, like John 5 or something. Almost ironically, because they seem to be so juxtaposed. They're not. They're both just white people with guitars. No, I'm kidding. They're not that different, you guys. Both singing about heavy machinery. Anyway. But it's possible to just enjoy music from one particular genre, you know. And sometimes when you hear a genre that's not the genre that you like to listen to, it's like, okay, I don't really like this. But give it a chance. Sometimes when you listen to music that's outside of your genre, you might realize there's something about it that's like uniquely. Yeah, yeah, you're right. Now other people have started to make metal and country, which is interesting. Ruth is pointing out, no, no, now other people are getting in on it. Like Christian rock, there's that joke, you know. For a long time, the Christian communities in America were against rock music. I mean, you can't really blame them. The bands are named Black Sabbath, and you know, like it's kind of hard for a Christian to look at that and be like, that guy just ate the head of a bat. Also, why is my kid, what's this Marilyn Manson shirt? Like, it's a lot, right? For some church-going families to have to be okay with all of this, especially when many of these bands like fly in the face of their reactionary. Anyway, so there's a joke. Isn't it funny that for a long time, the Christian communities in America and around the world were rejecting rock and roll, and then in only a few short years, there was this new genre called Christian rock. It's funny because it's like if you can't beat them, join them. When I got to America, this is the first time like I came to a Christian country and I was like interacting with people who grew up in like a Christian environment. And one friend was telling me like when she was young, they were all kept in the church on Halloween night to prevent them from going out and trick or treating, right? Because it's like that's a heathen like pagan activity or something like that. And I was like, oh my God. Oh, and they were like, oh my God. Like so then what did you do in the church? And they were like, oh, well, you know, we like found other things to do. Like we played our games, and the whole thing was to make it sound like it was more fun to be in the church than to go out and trick or treat. I was like, you guys should have just had your own trick or treating. Like you should have just gone, like you should have all dressed up as evangelists and gone from door to door and preached the name of the good Lord. And if anybody tried to offer you candy, and immediately you reject it and say that thy treasures are not to be found in moth and rust and things that get corrupted. Like your treasures are in heaven. I'm like, wouldn't that be the appropriate response? Anyway, I had some fun with that thought. The thought of like Christian Halloween, like what would it look like? I guess going from door to door and burning any witch you can find. I'm kidding. I had a bit too much fun with that idea. It went into like Inquisition territory and trying to think like what is a Christian Halloween? Anyway, why are we talking about this? Something about God knows, but something about music and it's perfectly fine to have a genre that you love the most and you listen to that genre exclusively. That's fine. But the project that I'm trying to do now in the next few lectures, thank you, Ashadevi. It's like let's like taste a few different genres of music, if you will, different traditions. And you'll see that they all actually kind of reference one another and build up on top of one another like that. That when you get the whole picture, it kind of snaps into focus and it becomes really exciting. Because then all, like I was saying earlier, all the elements in our tradition that we take for granted are suddenly put into context and they become that much richer. So hearing a guitar in a country music context can help us appreciate a guitar more in like a heavy metal context and vice versa. So being able to appreciate the universal principles that are common to all music helps us appreciate more genres, and more importantly, appreciating more genres can take us beyond the genres to that which all genres are rooted in. Music itself. So there are some people, of course, who love a specific kind of music, and that's all right. But then there are also some people, Ramakrishna, for instance, and I'm speaking now in a metaphor, of course. I don't mean this literally, because he loved a very specific kind of music, actually. He loved all music, but religious music specifically. But anyway, there are some people who love music itself. And so whatever music you give to them, whether it's ska or waltz or like whatever, like classical music to heavy metal to country, they will enjoy it because they're hearing something beyond the music. But importantly, they can also enjoy the unique characteristics that make each genre distinct. So it's not like they're just enjoying music in this indeterminate way. They're enjoying music as it's expressed in that particular genre, which kind of requires that you enter into that world for a little while. So new things are sometimes created because of that, the ability to bring two things together, like No Doubt, for instance. I don't know how new that it's not that's not actually new. It references a tradition in punk that's been going on for a long time. But it's kind of interesting to think of ska and like like reggae music and to think of punk and how those two things can come together, or something like funk and rock, like in the case of the Chili Peppers or something like that. This wonderful possibility that comes when things can be appreciated in their own way, and then when they can be brought together in that rasika, in that person who has that broadness of vision, if you will. So it's the springtime now, and and by the way, I'm taking my time because this is a project that I think can span many, many lectures, and it requires a lot of these disclaimers because the way that we're trying to do it now, I don't think has been done before because it hasn't been done in the light of Sri Ramakrishna yet. The project that I'm going to undertake is an age-old one. It's been done a million times at least by a million different people, but usually from a sectarian point of view, from a pluralistic point of view, from a religious exclusivist point of view, or from a religious inclusivist point of view. Usually it's done from a religious inclusivist point of view, but very rarely, I think, if ever, is it done from a pluralistic point of view. So that's why I want to present all of these concepts in the beginning and give rigorous disclaimers before actually doing the work, before actually going into each of these schools of philosophy, because they're so rich. But I want to give the disclaimer that they each should be enjoyed and appreciated in their own right, but also they should be comparatively studied so that we can see why a certain term might appear in a certain school and where it might have come from and how its usage might have changed over the course of the various centuries in which it is used. Because you have to remember that we're engaging with a tradition that spans over several centuries. And we're interacting with the cumulative, peer-reviewed, corroborated wisdom of a tradition that's hundreds and hundreds of years old, whose teachings are all available in the original form over the course of those hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Which brings me to my next point, which I was making last week. The texts are very important. So, like I was saying last week, this is not just a survey of ideas, it's also a catalog of the texts in which those ideas appeared and an introduction to the authors who are really realized masters from whom those texts have emerged. So these ideas are rooted in text, and those texts are rooted in people, and those people are rooted in God, so to speak. They're each of them rooted in an experience of God, which they are articulating. And it's very exciting because they're not articulating this stuff in a vacuum. It's not like they realized God and were like, you guys, here's the new religion. I am the way, the truth, and life. Here it is. This is the book. Just follow this. It's not like that. The moment they had their realization, they immediately asked themselves, wait, how does this compare to everything else that's already available in my cultural milieu? And now I'm going to write a text in order to present my realization, which I uniquely had through my sadhana and through the grace of my guru and through the grace of God. I must first interact with all the other ideas that are contrasting to mine. I must assimilate those ideas that are like mine but are not exactly like mine. I must somehow harmonize those, and I must defeat those ideas that are unlike mine in order to establish mine in the context of all the other ideas. That's the exciting thing about these texts. So I'm going to talk about text in the course of this series, or in the course of the next however many lectures it takes me to do this, that we've never mentioned before. And they're most of them going to be Sanskrit texts, of course. But I also want to point out that as far as the Shaiva Siddhanta is concerned, the Tamil Shaiva Siddhanta tradition and the Sanskrit Shaiva Siddhanta tradition make the same claims. They're pretty much one to one the same. So of course we can go into the Tamil text too, like the Shiva Purana of Manika Vasa, or more importantly the Shiva Jnana Bodham of Maikanda Deva and whatnot. But I'm going to stick to the Sanskrit text, mostly because the reason I'm choosing this is because I think it has a more pan-Indian appeal. So those who are not Tamils, who don't have access to the Tamil language, might still have a chance at accessing the Sanskrit version, which again is more or less the same thing as the Tamil Shaiva Siddhanta. So I'm going to present Tamil Shaiva Siddhanta, but I'm going to present it through the Sanskrit literature that's available, which is a lot. There's a lot of Shaiva Siddhanta, dualistic Shaiva tantric materials, and we haven't really studied them together, so I want to, if you don't mind. I want to study all the dualistic Shaiva materials. I want to study the Pashupāta dualism that we find in Nyaya and Vaisheshika. I want to study the Shaiva Siddhanta dualism. I want to study also the various forms of qualified non-dualism that we get in Shaivism, starting with Lakulīśan. Many people think Lakulīśan is a dualist, but he's not. Actually, that tradition is more of a Vishisht Advaita kind of tradition. So we can study Lakulīśan and his very ascetic Pashupāta reform, and then we can study the Vishisht Advaita Shaivas, arguably founded by Sri Kanta, and then we can also study the Vishesh Advaita Shaivas, which are very much affiliated with the Veera Shaivas or the Lingayat Shaivas, to whom the great Basavana belongs, and to whom the great Mahadevi Akka belongs, like that. So we can study Shaiva saints also in light of these various schools of philosophy, but each one has a distinct flavor. And there's some like really interesting arguments that you would never hear in the non-dual world that you hear in this like dualistic, qualified non-dualistic world. So I want to study all of that, like the brands of Shaivism that we don't usually get to study. Also, we've never heard probably of Nandikeshwara Shaivism. It might be cool to study that form of Shaiva monism and compare it to the other forms of Shaiva monism that we might be more familiar with. And then there's another form of Shaivism. It might not even be considered a philosophy per se, but a kind of scientific alchemical tradition called Raseshwara Shaivism. These are like the Shaiva alchemist, like turning base metals into gold kind of thing, trying to live forever and drinking mercury kind of thing. Like that's also a really, really interesting movement within Shaivism that we don't get to talk about. So what about the Rasheshwaras? Like what were they up to? What were they trying to do, and what was their worldview? That's something worth exploring. And so I just wanted to present, just to whet your appetite a little bit, like a list, just a brief cursory list. This list comes from K.C. Pandey, who put out a 3-volume commentary on the um, Ishvara Pratyabhigya Vivritti Vimarshini of Abhinava Gupta, and he lists these 8. So I'm just going to borrow K.C. Pandey's list here and present a few different forms of Shaivism. So Pashupāta dualism, this includes Nyaya and Vaisheshika, 2 schools of very ancient Indian philosophy. The Lakulīśa Pashupāta school, which is called the Pashupāta, but it's not dualism. It's like a reform movement. But both of these are, properly speaking, ascetic movements. They are predominantly ascetic cremation ground dwelling movements. Then there's the Shaiva Siddhanta dualism, and this is not actually dualistic because it accepts not the 10 dualistic agamas only, but it includes also 18 qualified non-dual agamas as well, including the Svachanda Tantra and Swayambhu Tantra and Raurava Agama, like that. These are not necessarily dualistic, but are actually dual come non-dual. So Shaiva Siddhanta, which is dualism, but it's willing to accept tantras that are not entirely dualistic, which is itself quite interesting. So this is the tradition, of course, that I grew up in, and this is the tradition that is synonymous with Tamil Shaivism. And it's a great foundation for everything that will come after. So this is, arguably, this is foundational tantra. The Shaiva Siddhanta is the foundation for Kali, for the Kali Kula. And then we have the Shaiva Vishisht Advaita. Anyway, here, Shakti is not stressed so much. Obviously, she's present, but she's not necessarily worshipped in the liturgies, nor is she really hymned in the litanies, though she's mentioned as a philosophical construct, if you will. So this is a Shiva, Sadashiva oriented tradition. So the main deity here is Sadashiva. Anyway, then there's the Vishisht Advaita, which is different from the Vishesh Advaita. But both of them are similar in that they're qualified non-dual. And so here you can meet Sri Kanta, and here you can meet the 5 Veerashaiva masters, including Basavana, the reformer, and Mahadevi Akka, who you might be familiar with. And then there's Nandikeshwara Shaivism, Raseshwara Shaivism, and of course this is like home base, right? So this is where we hang out most of the time. So this is the stuff that we usually study: Abhinava Gupta and Kshema Raja and Jayarata and Yoga Raja and like all that good, like what people tend to call Kashmir Shaivism. It's a misnomer because although many of the authors were in Kashmir, don't forget that there are many great Shaiva Siddhanta masters in Kashmir too. So it's like people say Kashmir Shaivism and they only mean Abhinava Gupta. I'd like to hear them talk a little bit more about Ramkanta and all the other great like Shaivas who are also in Kashmir and who are proponents of this system, which is actually the dominant system in Kashmir now amongst Kashmiri Brahmins. They practice predominantly Shaiva Siddhanta based on the Swachanda Tantra, which Kshema Raja tries to text torture a bit by saying, aha, the name of the Tantra is obviously a reference to its Advaita, no? Because Swachanda means freedom, and you can only be free if you're Advaita. Except the text is pretty heavily in Dvaita. But you'll see, like, there are a lot of masters in Kashmir who try to give a monistic reading of these texts, and there are also masters who like to give a dualistic reading of these texts, and many of them are in Kashmir, both of them. So you can't really just call this Kashmir Shaivism. It's better maybe to call it Advaita Shaiva Vada, because it wasn't happening only in Kashmir, it was happening everywhere. But yes, some of its dominant writers, the most famous and maybe arguably in some sense most important writers like Abhinava Gupta and Utpala Deva, of course, were in Kashmir. So this is what people tend to call Kashmir Shaivism. So, you can put this in a sort of logical sequence. First you get Pashupata dualism, and then you get the Lakulīśa reform, and then the Shaiva Siddhantins come and clean up the act of all this dusty, dirty cremation ground gremlin types, and then you get a nice, respectable, householder-oriented, and arguably this is when the tradition gets really refined. All this stuff is like the Lego blocks are scattered all over the floor, and some structures are pretty much built, but here you get the full Death Star. Here, like somebody actually came and picked up all the Lego blocks and like built a superstructure. Like this is elegant and beautiful, and oh my God, it's unbelievably majestic in ritual and in theory and in philosophy. So, sorry, I said theory and philosophy, in ritual and in philosophy. So that's Shaiva Siddhanta. And you can consider this as a kind of specialized revelation that comes after this. And so you move through asceticism into a household dualistic tradition, into a sort of half ascetic, half household, qualified non-dualism. And then you start to get some non-dualism, and finally you culminate in Advaita. And so you can consider this a logical progression. It's not quite true to say it's a chronological progression because a lot of these texts were written after these texts were already available. So a lot of this stuff responds to this stuff, which it could only have done if they were developing kind of at the same time. So I think a chronological reading might not be fair. These two are chronologically prior, arguably, to all of this. So it's arguable that these two are chronologically prior, but it's probably wrong to say that this is a chronological progression. So you can't say 1 through 8 is a journey through history chronologically. You could argue that it's a journey through history in terms of ideas. So you could argue it's not chronological but logical, as K.C. Pandey himself argues. So when K.C. Pandey does this survey, he's obviously privileging Advaita as the creme de la creme of Shaivism. Like this is the best that we got, and it took us all these hundreds of years to get there. Like all of this is, if you peel back if you open the box and you trace the source of all the products, you'll get this. But this is the best. So you could argue that also it's a logical, not necessarily a chronological, but logical progression, which is religious inclusivism. The idea that it's hierarchical in nature and that this is the highest and these are increasing in order of like epicness or truth value. Anyway, I've expressed the mantra marga as starting with Shaiva Siddhanta because it's generally believed that there's the Ati marga, which tends to be ascetic tantra, and there's the mantra marga, which tends to favor more householders, and this is tantra proper. So what we call tantra is generally the teaching and the system formulated by the mantra marga, which has a few different forms. So there's a Shaiva Siddhanta, which we're going to discuss quite a bit over the course of a few lectures. But then there's this non-dual tantra, and these come in the form of the Bhairava agamas. So we've talked about this a lot too, how the mantra pita and the vidya pita are two branches of the Bhairava agama, and how you get a group of people called the kapalikas and the yoginis who are interested in power, not necessarily in liberation. All of these people are interested in liberation, but these kapalikas and yoginis, they might be interested in just power. And so they're going to the cremation ground for different reasons than what these guys were in the cremation grounds for. And when I say these guys, I mean it literally. They were probably mostly men in this tradition. And so these male Brahmin ascetics, they were in the cremation ground out of devotion to Rudra with the hope of attaining liberation from Rudra. Whereas these people, many of them might have been going to the cremation ground, not for liberation, but for power, for siddhis. So that's important in the Vidya Pita as well, the inclusion of magical practices as part of the religious superstructure. So there's the Yamala, there's the Vāma Marga, and there's the Shakti Marga. So our tradition, of course, is in this Shakti Marga. And here you first get the Trika expression, para, and apara. And of course, the main tantras here are the Siddha Yogeshwari Mata and the Malini Vijayotara Tantra and the Tantra Sadbhava, plus this like extensive commentarial tradition, which is typically called Kashmir Shaivism, Shiva Sutras, Pañcarātra, etc. Now, Abhinava Gupta considers the Malini Vijayotara Tantra, as I've been saying in previous lectures, the main tantra, the be-all, end-all of all tantras. He thinks there's nothing to be found in any of his works. He argues this for the Tantrāloka specifically. There's nothing, he says, in my Tantrāloka that is not to be found in the Malini Vijayotara Tantra. But like I was saying in another place, there's lots of stuff in his Tantrāloka that doesn't seem to be coming directly from the Malini Vijayotara Tantra. For instance, Kali. Abhinava Gupta is obsessed with Kali. Kali is the name for the absolute principle of reality. He's getting that from the Krama tradition, the 12 Kalis, for instance. But none of that is in the Malini Vijayotara Tantra. So how do you understand this? He says, what the Malini calls Matra Sadbhava is what I'm calling Kali. So he does this kind of remarkable work of reinterpreting some of this stuff to start introducing Kali along the lines of the Trika and the Krama. But Kali properly appears in this tradition called the Kali tradition, which comes from texts like the Tantra Raja, Bhattaraka, and the Jayadratha Yamala Tantra, like that. So here she's given the name Kala Sankarshini or Krisha. So this Kali, this is the Kali that Abhinava Gupta uses as the ultimate principle of the Trika. So there's para, and apara, and there's the Kali, the one in whom the three appear. And because you have now a four 4 times 3 model, as it were, you can get the 12 Kalis. So this is from the Krama. So the Devya, Yamala Tantra, and Gyanitra Nata is an important teacher. Of course, there are these 2 lineages too that I don't actually know that much about. I don't have any dikshas into either of these lineages, but there's a Guya Kali and Mata lineage as well. So anyway, so there's all this stuff. I've looked at one text in this particular lineage, but I don't know very much about it. But these are the ones that we typically study. Trika, Kali, Krama. But notice, if you consider all of this a chronological sequence, then this is like sort of the final realization. Like Kali emerges out of Shiva, who emerges out of the goblin. So it's like there's the goblin, Shiva stands on the goblin, and then Kali stands on Shiva. So this is like a hierarchy in terms of chronology. And if you conflate chronology with logic or with terms of higher orders of revelation, then you get this idea that these are the lowest levels of revelation, the most superficial aspects of reality, working its way up to the most refined, most esoteric aspect of reality, Kali. And she comes as the final touch, if you will, the ultimate realization as a result of a logical and chronological sequence. But, and I think this is the argument I want to make, if you just think of these as various flavors, look how wonderful this is. You have so many different ways to enjoy a great thing. And Kali is one of those ways. It's my favorite way, but it's just one reading of a really deep tradition. And so I want to get into all of this stuff with you. I just started trying to map out some of this stuff a little bit today, and I'm getting very excited because there's just so much to study, and we do ourselves a disservice because we study so little of it. Or rather, I think we are done a disservice because we are each of us given so little access to the rich world. We are presented spirituality as if the way it's presented is the only way it can be interacted with. No? It's like usually we come to a community and the community only has one particular framework of spirituality, which is also comforting. This work that we're doing is challenging because the head will spin a bit. It'll be like, wait, so what's what actually? I can't quite make sense of up or down or left or right. Like, what are you actually saying? Because it seems like we're going to be saying a lot of different things in a short order of time. So anyway, I just want to put all of this in front of you, and I want to make this case. You can look at all the philosophies of Shaivism in terms of religious exclusivism. You could say your school alone is right and the other schools are wrong. Sometimes Abhinava Gupta does this. There are verses in the Tantrāloka where he says any mantra that you receive from the Shaiva Siddhanta is lifeless, it's powerless, it has no mantra virya. And here what he's saying is that the Shaiva Siddhanta is just wrong. It's just flat out wrong. It's not rooted in reality in the way that his Kali mantras are. And there's a particular section in Tantrāloka where he reveals a mantra. He gives one. It's obviously you can't say it out loud. It's a bija mantra. It's a dissolution mantra. It's not the bija mantra for Kali that we're typically used to. It also starts with ka, but it doesn't have the same sound as the Kali mantra, the bija that we're typically chanting when we chant with Kali. So it's a very powerful bija, and then he goes on to explain with regards to that bija that this is unique to this tradition and it's really powerful, and the Shaiva Siddhanta mantra is lifeless. So you get that tone sometimes from these masters, religious exclusivist tone. It's there with regards to Vaishnava Tantra too. The Vaishnava tradition is founded upon a different kind of Tantra. It's called the Pañcarātra Tantra. And Abhinava Gupta, he says, it's good, but it's not great. Why? Because they're bound by their Raga Tattva. They have this attachment to God. And that sounds like a good thing, but Abhinava Gupta says it's a problem because the Raga Tattva continues to reify the idea of separateness. And as long as you feel separate from God, you can't have this Advaitic realization. So Vaishnava Tantra shoots itself in the foot from the very beginning because of their sentimentalism and so these are like exclusivist statements, no? That we have a monopoly almost on the highest truth. So from time to time, you get this tone from these masters, like Utpala Deva in his Shiva Sutravali, he'll say, those who worship Vishnu and those who worship Brahma will never know such joy. He'll say in such places. So you get sometimes a bit of a sectarian tone. So then the same thing can be leveraged against the dualist. The dualist will also say the only reason that this particular master commented upon this text in a monistic way is because they were not given a chance to study the Shaiva Siddhanta. If they had only come into contact with this philosophy, they would not have committed such an egregious error as misreading this text along monist lines. In truth, this text is dualistic, and then they'll explain. So this kind of language is used by the dualists, and so it's very competitive because the monistic schools will try to reinterpret all the dualistic agamas in a monistic way, and the dualistic schools will do the same for the monistic agamas. And so there's this very competitive academic and religious and spiritual environment where each person is trying to prove that their tradition is exclusively true and the other traditions are just wrong. They're just a mystery. They miss the point, if you will. This is called religious exclusivism. More often than not, though, Tantra takes a religious inclusivist tone. So a really good example for this in Tibetan Tantra is in the book called it's in the title of the book, Progressive Stages of Meditation on Emptiness. It's one of my favorite books on, I mean, I haven't studied that much of the literature, granted, compared to, our tradition. But what I have read of that tradition is one of my favorite books. It's a modern book by Sotrim Gyatso Rinpoche. And he lists all the schools of Buddhism in a hierarchy. In fact, I presented this hierarchy in the lecture called Ma Kali and the 5 levels of the void. Those levels, the 5 levels of the void, I presented in terms of a hierarchy, making the case that the highest level of the void is the best. It's the deepest, the most essential teaching, if you will. And so that's called religious inclusivism, that religions build on top of each other. So this view is quite common in Tantra, to say that the other traditions aren't wrong. They had part of the picture, but not the whole picture. And they're good also because without them, we couldn't have built our realization. So often this is the dominant view in Shaiva Tantra, that Lord Shiva gives his realization hierarchically. First, he gives duality. And honestly, in the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra, it sounds like this. Lord Shiva in verses 7 through 13, he's basically saying like, oh, all of that stuff is good, but it's for children. He says it, he says the anthropomorphic form of Shiva that you've all been worshipping, Shiva with form as like a god, like Sadashiva. Essentially, I think he has in mind Sadashiva or the Navatma Bhairava. He has in mind some of these like earlier cult worship forms. I don't mean cult pejoratively, just like religious forms. And he says like it's good, but only insofar as it's sweets to lure children into the right action and a goblin story to scare children away from the wrong action. So Shiva himself, I mean, what to say of Abhinava Gupta and Shema Raja and human commentators, but Shiva himself sometimes takes a religious inclusivist tone. So it's not like he's saying these things are wrong any more than he's saying you shouldn't give children sweets. Actually, some education specialists say that you shouldn't. But he's not saying that. He's saying like it's good to give children sweets and it's good to give them goblin stories, but that's only a means to an end. Now let me give you the real thing. That's what the Vijnana Bhairava sounds like a little bit. Anyway, in the first verse 7 to 13. So it's possible, that religious inclusivism might be the dominant mode in the tantric world of like making sense of all this diversity. So they'll say there is one reality, but there are successive stages or progressive stages of realization of that reality. And Advaita, or especially the Advaita of Kali, is the highest realization. And like I was saying, it seems to the one who has that view to make perfect sense. After all, seeing God as a father is good. Seeing God as a mother is better. Seeing God as good is good. Seeing God as both good and bad is better. Seeing God with form is good. Seeing God as formless is better, but best is seeing God as both. And seeing God as transcendent is good. Seeing God as immanent is better, but best is seeing God as both transcendent and immanent. Seeing God as the other is good. Seeing God as the whole and myself as the part is great, but best is seeing myself as one with God. And you get the best, arguably, in the Kali tradition, because here we understand God is both transcendent and also immanent. We understand that God is formless and with form, impersonal and personal. We understand that God is a mother, so there's no notion of purity or impurity. We understand that God is also evil, and so there's no fear of terror, knowing that those things are her play also. And we know that I am God. Like what could be better than that? That sounds like the most mature, most refined, most capacious, most inclusive religious view. To some people, it's not everybody's cup of tea, you see. It's certainly mine. But it doesn't necessarily have to be yours. So again, I'm trying to fight against this tendency of communities to default to the biases of certain members of that community. Like the community is diverse and there are different people in communities with different religious predispositions, but often the buffet table is not diverse enough to cater to that. And so we're lucky because we're in the tradition of Ramakrishna. So there's a wider. Okay, anyway, I want to finish up this lecture and get into some Q&A with you. So what I want to propose instead of this inclusivism. So anyway, you get this a lot in Abhinava Gupta as well, this religious inclusivism. I think predominantly this inclusivism is found. So he'll say the Vedas, very good. You need them. Because ultimately the Tantras are just a Vedic renaissance. He'll say so, Abhinava Gupta will say, and he has said in his Tantrāloka and other places, especially in his Tantrāloka, that the Vedas were taught by Shiva himself. And more importantly, they were forgotten. And so in this Kali Yuga, in order to restore Vedic knowledge in a way that's like meaningful for the people of this day and age, Lord Shiva manifests his Shrikanta form. And as Shrikanta, an incarnation of Shiva, he teaches duality, qualified non-duality, and non-duality. And to Triambaka, he gives non-duality. And Triambaka's daughter then founds this Kaula Trika. So when Abhinava Gupta traces his lineage, he traces it back to Shiva, and he claims that Shiva is offering the Vedas. So it's not that Abhinava Gupta has a problem with the Vedas. In fact, most of these tantric masters were Vedic Brahmanical Brahmins who followed every Vedic rule. That's one thing to point out. They weren't Avaidikas. They didn't reject the Vedas like the Buddhists and the Jains did. They premised much of their teaching on the Vedas, only they argue that they went beyond the Vedas. But they started with the Vedas. So Abhinava Gupta will present the Shruti and the Smriti, or rather the Śrauta and the Smārta traditions, as like the foundation for all of this. But the next level, arguably, is Vaishnava Pañcarātra, because devotion is a bit higher than Vedism. And then even higher than that is the Pashupāta asceticism. So he has a place for these ascetics, but they're not very high. They're higher than the Vedas, but lower than the Shaiva Siddhanta. Because in Tantra, the householder is glorified. Right? Like asceticism is kind of embarrassing, in a sense. So you can see the Tantrikas are, in a sense, reacting against Shankarites and Buddhists who make it sound like to be spiritual, you have to give up all the joy in life. Right? Because Advaita Vedanta, and this is what really baffles me. So many people are studying Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta, and then they come to me and tell me about their cognitive dissonance. I'm like, how could you be surprised? You're studying a tradition that was taught by a monk for monks. and, and male monks, mind you. Like, what kind of a Buddhist are you? You have a wife and children, and like, you want to be in the world and go to work. What kind of a nonsense Buddhist are you? Yes, you're bald, but you're not walking around with a coconut bowl right now. Like, in what sense do you think this is going to work for you? At best, you're uncomfortable with God and you want some kind of like atheist self-help thing, so you've defaulted to Buddhism, forgetting that this is a dharma taught by monks for monks. So you're surprised that your Buddhism leaves you with a weird sense of cognitive dissonance? I'm sorry, but it takes more than a Vipassana Goenka retreat to attain nirvana. Although that, I mean, maybe not. For some people they might. But again, it's just, it doesn't quite work. The context is the context of the teaching and the context in which it's being applied in modern day doesn't quite match up. And so Advaita Vedanta is the exact same thing. It's very helpful, and it's oriented towards a certain kind of person. And so if you're a monk, party time, it will work. So Tantra, it in a sense, this kind of Tantra, which I'm saying, much of Tantra has become ascetic now. But this form of Tantra in Abhinava Gupta's time, when he was creating this inclusivist system, he felt it was more appropriate for those who were in the world and didn't problematize the world, for whom art was still viable. And I asked Swami Sarvaprabhu once, actually, we were doing a retreat, the one and only retreat that I got to do with him. I hope we get to do another one because it was really wonderful and fun. The debate that we had was really nice. I really enjoyed it. But in one place, I was like, why is there so little art in these world negating illusionist schools? Do you think it has to do with the philosophy? Like, if the world is unreal, then the beauty of the world is also suspect. Does that then lend itself to an aversion of art? At least Zen Buddhism is rooted in a bit of Tantric Buddhism. It's a Mahayana form of Buddhism. So every now and then you can eke out, a poem, and usually it's a haiku or like some circle or something. Like they produce a bit of art. But you don't get it from Advaita Vedanta. Like at most you get beautiful works of literature, and there's poetry. And again, we can question whether or not Bhaja Govinda was written by Shankara, etc. Like, but dismissing all of that, and the great masters like Buddha and Shankara aside, why does it seem like there's not that much art? Whereas in devotional dualistic religion, take Christianity for instance, oh my God, the cathedrals and the paintings and the poems and the Dante's Divine Comedy, and like there's just so much art per square inch of dualistic devotional realist religion. So is it the philosophy that causes there to be this dearth of art? And Swami Sarvaprabhu like laughed and smiled at me very wryly. And he's like, I don't think it's necessarily the philosophy. I think it's monasticism. And we had a good laugh about that. It's like, no, I think there's something about being in society and participating with, engaging in culture that keeps one in the artistic world. And so, it's like, it's all these things that were considered sensual enjoyments by monastic traditions are reinterpreted, even by the Shaiva Siddhanta, as being valuable and important in spiritual life. So see the Vedic revivalism here, because in the Vedas, a householder's life is usually enjoined up to a point. Anyway, so Abhinava Gupta places this Shaiva Siddhanta above the ascetics, because the Mantra Marga is the householder version of the Ati Marga. And then from there, he gets the Bhairava Agamas. And he says, the Bhairava Agamas are higher. And higher than that is the like, Shakti Agamas, the Trika. The Trika is the best. And it gives like hierarchies, various hierarchies, like Kaula is better than Vāma, and Trika is better than Kaula. I forget exactly. And if you look at the tantras themselves, like the Kularnava Tantra, Lord Shiva there presents something very similar. He presents a very similar hierarchy. So it could be that Abhinava Gupta and has some tantras like this in mind. Unlikely the Kularnava Tantra, but maybe, because that probably came much later. But Abhinava Gupta has tantras in mind where this kind of religious inclusivism is done. So usually, in almost every case, if not all cases, when we do the kind of work which we're doing now, you get it from a religious inclusivist perspective. Now, what I want to do, Ma willing, is to do all of this from a Ramakrishna perspective, in the light of Sri Ramakrishna, which again is that is also debatable what that looks like. But I'm going to argue that it looks like religious pluralism. It looks like not saying any one thing is higher than anything else, but saying these are all wonderfully valid readings of the truth. I think it's in that spirit that we should engage with all of this. So anyway, I think that's enough for now. I just wanted to sketch out this overarching picture of all the various schools of Shaivism. Oh, actually, no, I should leave you with a little bit of philosophy before we go. Thus far, a survey. Let me just say a few things about the Shaiva Siddhanta to whet your appetite for a fuller discussion about it. So I put some notes over here, and you can see that the Shaiva Siddhanta is based on 28 agamas. And we could list them all, but I just gave a few examples here. And some of these examples that I provided, Raurava Agama, Swayambhuva Agama, Swachandra Tantra, these, if you study them, you'll see that they're kind of qualified non-dualism, actually. They're not necessarily dualistic. So it's generally claimed, and Abhinava Gupta claims this too, that there are 10 dualistic agamas. Some of them are available, but not in Sanskrit. They're available in other scripts. But they are available, these 10 agamas. And then these 18 agamas are also available. Again, some of them are in other scripts other than Devanagari and in other dialects other than Sanskrit. But here we have the 18 qualified non-dual agamas and 10 dualistic agamas. And the Shaiva Siddhanta is actually based on all of them. So 28 agamas form its foundation. And one of the most important commentators of this tradition, maybe even the founder, I would argue, of the Shaiva Siddhanta, his name is Sadhyo Jyoti. And in the text, he's sometimes called Ketapala or Ketakananda. Sadhyo Jyoti traces his lineage back to Ruru Shiva, who revealed the Raurava Agama. So another thing you'll notice about these traditions is they often trace their lineage back to Shiva in some form. Again, a particular revelation of the ultimate reality. So Ruru Shiva might be different from, I don't know, another form of Shiva, like Srikanta Shiva or something. Maybe different forms of Shiva have different realizations of Shiva. I don't know. But Ruru Shiva, the lineage goes through Ugra Jyoti and to Sadhya Jyoti. So Sadhya Jyoti composed many, many texts. He lived probably at the close of the 10th century. So he's roughly a contemporary of Abhinava Gupta. Many people argue he lived in Kashmir. He probably didn't. I don't know, but historically it can be confusing to like locate some of these people. But his work was popular in Kashmir anyway. And he had a Moksha Karika, which he wrote in 900 AD. And this is important because it was commented on by a very important South Indian master named Aghora Shiva. He also had another text called the Bhoga Karika, which is interesting. Stanzas on liberation and stanzas on enjoyment. Then there's this text called the Tattva Sangraha, which received a commentary by Narayana Kanta. Then there's the Tattva Traya Nirnaya, and this is my favorite, the Pada Moksha Nirasa Karika. In this text, in the Pada Moksha Nirasa Karika, he critiques liberation in all other traditions. And it's quite a comprehensive survey. It shows you how rich the philosophical world was at the time of Sadhya Jyoti's writing. So he looks at all the other views of liberation. He says it's not ultimately liberation. So I'll just give you a taste of that. There are three types of liberation that were quite dominant in the Shaiva world at that time. The first is called Utpatti Samata Paksha. Paksha means view. So the Utpatti Samata Paksha means the view that qualities such as oh, thank you, Anjani, the 12 Kalis, yes. Qualities such as omniscience and omnipotence arise as a result of liberation. Now, this is a big difference, a marked contrast from the Pashupatas, because according to the Pashupatra Sutra, according to the Pashupatas, before the Pashupata Sutra of Lakulīśan, liberation meant only Dukkhanta, which is the Buddhist view, that liberation, the Theravadan Buddhist view, that liberation is really just nirvana, the end of suffering. It doesn't mean anything else. But according to Lakulīśan and some of the other Shaivas, actually liberation means the attainment of the qualities called omniscience and omnipotence. So I talked a little bit about this last week. Liberation isn't just the end of suffering, it's also the attainment of something great, some higher thing, something worth attaining. It's not just getting rid of something, it's also attaining something, namely omniscience and omnipotence. So according to the Utpatti school, these arose as a result of liberation. And the argument against this is that, like, anything that starts must also end. So if you didn't have it to begin with, and if it only came as a result of liberation, then there's a beginning, no? And anything that has a beginning must have an end. So if you gained omniscience and if you gained omnipotence, then those are things that you can also come to lose. Therefore, this view is rejected. How can it be liberation if it's a state that comes and goes? See, the Buddhists would be very comfortable with this refutation because they say nirvana can't be gaining anything, because if you were to gain something, then there's a start. And if there's a start, there must be an end. So what can be gained can also be lost. If your liberation is merely a state, then like all things, it must pass. So similarly, the Sadhya Jyoti and the masters like that, they take down this Utpatti Samata Paksha view by saying like, no, it's not something you can gain, because then it means it's something you can lose. So the other view is this, the Samata Sankranti view. And this view is held by people like Lakulīśan. So they say, well, it's a bit like fragrance. When you come near something that's fragrant, you get that fragrance. Transmission. So it's like it carries on to you. So by getting closer and closer to Shiva, you become more and more like Shiva because his qualities transfer to you. This view is also rejected for reasons aforementioned, because if it's something that you gain as a result of, I don't know, like contagion or something, it's also something you can lose. But also, they also say there's no real metaphor for this. They criticize it by saying it's kind of incoherent. And thirdly, they say, and even if we accept that it's something you gain from Shiva, in every possible metaphor of this transference, like say in the case of heat, the transmitter loses the quality, and the transmittent, the one to whom it's transmitted, gains the quality. So if Lord Shiva is giving omniscience and omnipotence by transmission, then he's also losing those things for you to be able to gain them. And how can that be true of Shiva? So that's rejected. Then there's this other view which I like. People ask me about this a lot. I get a lot of messages about this because it's quite an important part of our tradition. Avesha Paksha. Isn't it just like possession? Like, isn't liberation just you get possessed by Lord Shiva? Like the way you'd be possessed by a spirit, except in this case, you're possessed by Lord Shiva. And in many temples, that's the goal, to be possessed by the deity that's being worshipped. Very Pentecostal in nature. And there's a lot of this like Pentecostal vibe in this tradition. So what about that? Is it like Avesha? And then he says, if it is in the case of Avesha, then you are being possessed by a deity, right? That's not freedom. And if moksha is freedom, possession is not freedom, possession cannot be moksha. In possession, you lose your freedom, actually. You don't gain freedom, you lose your freedom. See, God is free. If God becomes free in me, am I free? No. I'm just now a vehicle for God's freedom. I have not attained liberation, actually. So if liberation is something that I can attain, if it's a freedom that I can get, it cannot be in the form of possession. Do you see? Now, the reason why this is so exciting, he refutes all these types of liberation in favor for the inherent omniscience and omnipotence of the soul. So this is what I want to stress. In Shaiva Siddhanta, in this dualistic view of Shaivism, first and foremost, the soul is argued to be innately divine. It always had the qualities of omniscience and omnipotence. These are not things that it attains as a result of moksha. It has it already. What a wonderful view. So the innate divinity of the soul idea, often people appropriate this to Advaita. They're like, it's only in Advaita that you get this idea that you are innately divine. Because at Advaita, they're bold enough to say that you are God. That's an Advaitic claim. No. Even in Shaiva duality, we say you are a soul. You're not a body, you're not a mind, you are a soul. And that soul is intrinsically and innately pure. It's innately divine. It's already omniscient. It's already omnipotent. So you are all-knowing and all-powerful as you are. Nothing can take that from you and nothing can ever give that to you. It's what you are actually. in your essence nature. So that's why Sri Ramakrishna sometimes would tell people it's not quite fitting to think that you are God. After all, that claim doesn't usually become tenable in your day-to-day life. But it is good to say that you are free. So people often get confused because they think that the only way you could say you are free is if you say you are God. It's an Advaitic claim that says, I'm not a sinner. I'm not in original sin. I am free. I am God. But no, it's perfectly possible to do this in duality too. Like you can still see God as the other. You can feel yourself as distinct from God. And yet, even then, affirm to yourself your innate purity. That's, I think, one beautiful thing about the Shaiva Siddhanta is that it, from the very beginning, argues your innate divinity to you. Okay, and then the next thing that it argues is quite exciting. Let me just quickly point that out. And the next thing it says is that there must be a separation, actually. Maybe I should talk about why it is that we don't feel omniscient and omnipotent, because there's something called mala. And mala is actual, like a cataract. So these things, Maya, sorry, I didn't put the transliteration marks. I typed them out quite hastily. So Maya, karma, the adjectival form, rodha, shakti, etc. These are pashas, right? Bondage. And these bondages are actually God's way of helping me mature my malas, my impurity. So a mala is a bit like an obscuration. The word literally means impurity. And the idea is that these are beginningless. They do not inhere in the soul, though. They're not actually part of the soul. The soul, again, like I said, is innately divine. It's omniscient and omnipotent. But there's a quality in this world that obscures that fact. This is called mala. And it's real. So it's helpful because it won't just do to say that it's not there. Sri Ramakrishna again would give the metaphor. He would say, it makes no sense to say you're not in pain when you're clearly crying and bleeding. And he says that's how many non-dualists are like. They spiritually bypass. They deny that they're suffering in the midst of their suffering, and therefore they don't seek any actual solution to that suffering. They just say it's not real. So Sri Ramakrishna says it's like a camel that's chewing a thorny bush, and all the while the camel's lips are being cut up and blood is pouring. He would give that metaphor for the way that we are with the world. The world causes suffering, and yet we can't stop chewing the bush. And then later he would say, and it's like being pricked by a thorn. It's no use saying you're not bleeding or not in pain when you clearly are. So another benefit of this tradition is it's not willing to dismiss our spiritual problems as merely imagined, because that can be a little invalidating. If you go to someone, you say, I'm struggling, and they say, oh, it's just an illusion, actually. You're seeing wrongly. You shouldn't ask, how can I solve this problem? You should ask, how can I correct my view such that the problem doesn't even exist? Which is the Advaitic solution to things often. So he says, no, I mean, it's real. Like you're suffering in a very real world because of a very real obscuration. So the problem, though, is that for me to perform the cataract surgery, the guru will say, we have to wait till the film becomes mature. So now they use the famous cataract example. And the cataract is something that's like actually in your eye, but it takes a while for it to get to the point where it can be removed. It has to mature. I don't know. I've never had a cataract. I don't know how this works, but the texts say that the film in the eye needs to like mature or something. I'm taking it on faith. I've never had a cataract, but allegedly God creates the world and then uses his Rodha Shakti or Nirodha Shakti or Tirobhava Shakti, his concealing power, to connect souls with the adequate body in order for them to like pay off their karmic debts. So he brings souls into contact with Mayic objects in Maya, in order that their impurities might actually mature. So God purposefully drags souls into bondage and continues to punish them and torture them in a sense, with delusion in a sense, so that they can get to the point where grace will work. To like help them surrender, if you will. You can put it in that way. But then that mala, that impurity, increases and increases and increases. And even as it increases, it's a good thing. Because as it increases, it becomes more and more real, more and more filmy, more and more thicker and thicker. And then the cataract surgery can come. And that cataract surgery is called God's grace. So God's grace ultimately frees us, but by God's grace also, we are bound. So both are expressions of God's grace, which is an idea that we get in the Shaiva dualistic system, that God is gracious to us even as he binds us with his Maya and with his karma and with his mala and with his Rodha Shakti in order to help get rid of this mala. And so the Diksha is very important because Diksha, and by the way, Diksha was articulated by Shaiva Siddhanta particularly as important because through Diksha, in a sense, you remove the cataract. Not really. It happens through grace only, but Diksha is the way to be open to that grace. or Diksha is in a sense causing that grace. You can even argue, which Abhinava Gupta in his Ishvara Pratyabhigya Viviti Vimarshani will like wholly reject. How can grace be caused? Is God a fish market that you can like pay for it with a Diksha? You know, isn't grace free? And if it's free, how can it be caused? Like that. Anyway, so Diksha can cause grace, and the subsequent rituals that you participate in as a result of your Diksha can also open you up to grace more and more. So Sri Ramakrishna here would say the winds of grace are always blowing. Now, you must unfurl the sails. So did the sails cause the grace? Not quite. The grace was always there, but the sails unfurled made one receptive to the grace that was always there. This is the way I can see of reconciling Abhinava Gupta's critique with this view. So it's not that you're causing the grace, but you need to do spiritual practice. You need to do actual things, like an actual diksha, actual rituals, actual practices. That's where Advaita can make a mistake. It's all up here, but there's no actual practice. There's no puja. And without puja, how are you going to impress upon the subconscious mind these truths that the conscious mind only tenuously can grasp? So there must be puja, there must be embodied practices, mantras, and there must be this all-important diksha, which is given a huge metaphysical and mystical significance in the tradition. So having said all of that, the mala is real and its solution is also real. But the suffering that we undergo in life is still God's grace because it's required to help aid the maturation of the film in the eye, which needs to happen for successful cataract surgery, right? Okay, but this is one of my favorite arguments actually, and we should definitely spend a little time next week on this. The idea for separation. So, like, there's an argument that there should be a difference between the efficient and the material cause. So here the argument is that Shiva, Pati, the Lord, is the efficient cause only, nimitta karana. He creates the world, but the world is different from him. It's the material cause. This is called pasha, or I guess you could just call it pradhana or maya, but it's some substance out of which the world is constructed. And in this maya are many beings, and they're called pashus. So these three are the main eternal categories, the tattvas, the three tattvas of Shaiva Siddhanta. Pati, the Lord, who is here the karana, the cause of the universe, the efficient cause only. Pasha, Maya, or the substance, which here can be called Pasha, the material cause, and those souls which eternally coexist with Pasha and with Pati, called Pashus. And of course, all of this is a play on the Vedic word Pashupati, which is a name for Rudra, which appears especially in the Krishna Yajurveda and many places. So Pashu means me, individual soul, which refers to the soul especially, not necessarily the body and mind, but it refers to the individual soul. Pati, the Lord, who is my God, and Pasha, the world in which all of us souls have our being. So each soul is distinct and individual and unique, and God is separate from the world, and the world is the effect, God is the cause. And the cause and the effect cannot be the same thing. God is the efficient cause, and the world is a material cause. Okay, why must there be a difference? So I like this idea to preserve the transience of the material world and to preserve the eternal nature of Shiva. Because the argument that we make in Shaiva Siddhanta is that if something is insentient and if something is many, therefore it's transient. Anything that is a compound, and Swami Vivekananda makes this argument too, comes together and comes apart. So a compound means a multiplicity. More than one thing's compounded means multiplicity. And more importantly, insentient things are all changing. If you look around and you'll see that anything insentient comes and goes. Insentience, jaratva, is synonymous with transience in this tradition. So the world is insentient. The argument is that things appear insentient. So how can Shiva, the efficient cause, be one with the material cause? After all, if the material cause is the same as the efficient cause, you're saying Shiva is insentient? Shiva is sentience itself. How can Shiva have any insentience in him? But there's clearly insentience in the world. And also, Shiva is uncompounded, and yet the world is clearly made of compounds. So since Shiva has no compounded nature, and since he is sentient, he therefore must be distinct from this world, which is insentient for the most part, and, more importantly, a compound. What a beautiful and elegant argument. So this argument of separation between God and the world preserves on philosophical and logical grounds the sentience and eternal nature of God, which is incommensurate with the insentient and transient nature of the world. It's a very simple but beautiful and elegant argument. The world and God must be different. And again, this doesn't mean distance, because the world is God's tool for helping mature the malas of certain souls in order that he might affect his grace onto them. But now, with regards to the world, there's actually two forms of the world. And Sri Ramakrishna would use this language too. There's Vidya Maya and there's Avidya Maya. In the language of Shaiva Siddhanta, it's called Shuddha Maya, or otherwise known as Maha Maya, or just Bindu, and then there's Maya proper. So Maya is this impure world, Ashuddha Maya, this world of empirical cause and effect, this world of matter. But there's another world, a divine world, and that's called the Bindu or the Maha Maya. And in that world, certain beings, celestial beings, live, and we can ascend to that realm too. So there's even a heaven realm posited, but it's still in the category of Pasha. One can even transcend that. Anyway, so that's a topic for another day. But all of this to say, the first reason why we want the separation is to preserve the transience of the world and the eternity of God. But also, Vaisheshika argues that time is eternal. Shaiva Siddhanta rejects that because it argues that time is insentient. So how can it be eternal? If something is insentient, it's transient. And more importantly, it's a compound because time is made up of the past, present, and future. You can't have time without these three things. Since time is a compound, because it's a multiplicity, and because it is insentient, it's therefore non-eternal. So Kala is not an eternal category. And it rejects, of course, the Nyayas and Vaisheshikas at their atom theory. Why atoms? How can they be eternal? They're insentient. And also there are many. Because there are many atoms, and because each atom is essentially insentient matter, it cannot be a basic building block of reality. Isn't that so beautiful? They're almost intuiting string theory in a sense. Anyway, so then the next thing, this is really beautiful. To preserve the characteristics of the former, which require an other to shine. So this is how they argue against Advaita Vedanta. They call Shankara a crypto-Buddhist. Actually, the Shaiva Siddhantins are a bit too classy for that. The Veera Shaivas would call Shankara crypto-Buddhist, which is like a huge insult because it means that you're positing nothing, right? Your philosophy is nothing. Because they don't say anything. They just say everything else is wrong, but they don't say anything. Advaita Vedanta says, no, we're saying something. There's Brahman. And you know what? Brahman is Sat, Chit, Ananda. So the characteristics of Brahman is that its existence, its consciousness, and its bliss, right? But wait a minute. If Brahman alone exists, and if there is no other apart from Brahman, who can appreciate those qualities? In other words, qualities, characteristics only inhere when there is an other to which they can be perceived. And of course, the Advaitin will say these aren't qualities. They're not gunas. They're characteristics, aspects. But to whom do these aspects appear? Why even posit aspects when there is no other to compare those aspects to? Might as well say there aren't any aspects. And if there aren't any aspects, how are you different from the Buddhist? You've posited a nihilistic nothing as your absolute. Right? So the argument against Advaita is to say that Advaita takes away from God's beauty. Because if God is a rasa, what's the point of a rasa without a rasika? Or what's the point of X without comparison to Y? That's the argument. So if God is going to have omniscience and omnipotence, you need a world where those things are limited. It's the argument of like, is something really good if there's no bad? Something like that. That's maybe the cheapest form of that argument. Anyway, and this is important too. To sensibly posit means as separate from the end. So you can't say the ends is a realization of Brahman, Advaita. And you can't then say the means is the contemplation of Brahman. The argument here is the moment you suggest contemplation, you've already suggested a contemplator and a contemplated. There are two things. And so if you deny the existence of the contemplator, you've just shot your upasana in the foot. In other words, you have invalidated your very own spiritual practices, which you are presenting as a means for your ends. First of all, there is a paradox in presenting the ends and the means as equal and still impressing upon us the need for a means. And by the way, many modern Advaitins will reject means. At least they're honest for doing so. They'll say you don't have to practice, you just have to realize. But even that act of realizing itself is a means. Advaita Vedanta is a sadhana. It's manana, you have to think, but to think you need shravana, you have to hear, and once you've heard and once you've thunk, then you contemplate. But to contemplate, that nididhyasana requires a contemplator, a subject, and something being contemplated upon. But if the subject and object are the same in this case, or if there's only Brahman, this cannot work. And if this cannot work, why posit it? All the Upanishads seem to posit it. The fact that it's being posited must imply, at least to some extent, that the means and ends are separate, that the contemplator and the contemplated are separate. And so that's another argument. So notice these are I think, quite sophisticated arguments for duality, actually. That these are all argued as reasons to maintain the separation of God and the world. So there's something to be said about that. And next week maybe we'll talk about how the Shaiva Siddhanta takes the five Karana, we talked about it last week. Karana, Karya, Yoga, Vidhi, and Dukkanta, the five tattvas of the Pashupatas, which appear in this Pashupata Sutra by Lakulīśan, commented upon by Kaundinya. It takes these five and reduces them to three. It takes Karana and calls it Pati. Karana means the cause of the world, which is God. It takes Karya, which means effect, really, but it calls it Pasha. And then it takes, oh no, sorry, in Karya is also included Pashus. They're also caused and they're dependent on God, but they're eternally coexistent with God. But it takes Pasha, Pashu, and Pati, and it gets those from the five. And Lakulīśan also takes he takes Vidya, Kala, and Pashu. He gets three, but he roots the three in Pati, the Lord. So that's what gives you this qualified non-dualism. Anyway, that's far afield for today. So these are some text for the Atimarga Lakulīśan school, these cremation ground dwelling fellas. And you can see like Gana, Karika, Yama, Prakarana, like obviously these are all cremation ground texts. And I will talk next week about how these are based on the Narayana Upanishad, from the Taittiriya Aranyaka. And then today we just sketched a little bit of Shaiva Siddhanta. But next week I want to talk about Nada and Bindu, because the Shaiva Siddhantas present a beautiful theory about Nada, Paranada, Bindu, all of that grammarian stuff, Smārta and all of that. It starts here in the Shaiva Siddhanta world. And so it culminates again, I use hesitantly, in the Kashmir Shaiva discussion of sound, of Shabda Brahman. But it's in Shaiva Siddhanta, arguably, that music is offered as a viable spiritual practice. It's in the Shaiva Siddhanta uniquely that art and music and language are all integrated as invariable aspects of spiritual life. So at a glance, Shaiva Siddhanta is an incredibly maximalist tradition. It involves rich temple architecture, very elaborate and rich rituals that are highly aesthetic in nature, and it's all rooted in a deep devotional fervor, a devotionalism that is premised upon the eternal separation between material cause and efficient cause, between the eternally coexistent soul and God, the Lord of all souls. And we exist to him in the relation that dogs exist to its hunter, the animals to its lord, the pashus to the patis. And so mala, it can be progressively removed up to the point that I can participate in the creation of the universe also. In the sense that I can, through purifying my malas, enter the supernal realm called this Bindu Tattva, the Shuddha Vidya Tattva, this pure realm in which I have some sense of my omniscience and some sense of my omnipotence. And like Lord Ananta and others, am part of the delegation of of Lord Shiva's monarchy. So the individual Pashu, the bound soul, can remove its Pashutva sequentially through the Lord's grace, propitiated through spiritual practice. And as a result, I can ascend the corporate ladder, if you will, of reality and take on higher and higher roles in that corporate ladder. So I can get promoted at Google, is the argument, through spiritual practice and through the Lord's grace. So there are two kinds of souls, you could argue. Oh, actually, no, there's three kinds of souls. There's the Sakalas and the Pralaya Kalas and the Vijnana Kalas. And so there are three types of souls. And then within Pasha, there's, of course, Mala, and there are three kinds of Malas. There's Anava Mala, which is called Pashutva, and there's Karma Mala, the doership, and Maya Mala, or Maya, it's just called. So there's so many different ways to like analyze each of these things. Maya is here real, it's not illusory, it's an actual material substance in which the five things, Kala, Niyati, Kala, Raga, Vidya, all of that appears within Maya. It's very rich philosophy. But basically, you get your 36 tattvas, you get the idea of Kundalini, you get the emphasis on Diksha, you get the fully fledged ritual and temple culture, which is very aesthetic and art oriented, which is to say, there's a lot of temple dance, a lot of music, a lot of poetry, all of that rooted in devotion to Lord Shiva. And most importantly, you get this idea that the soul is innately pure, and it's only a matter of removing the obstruction that prevents you from seeing that. Once that obstruction is removed, the innate omniscience and omnipotence of the soul shines forth. And ideally, we become exactly like Shiva. That's the argument. And we already are. We just have to remove the impurity. Then we become exactly like Shiva, which importantly allows us to finally love Shiva truly. It's only when you become God that you can worship God. And this principle is there even in Shaiva dualism. Anyway, so I just want to sketch that out for you. Now, why would all of this be important for like the 12 Kalis, for instance? I better make a mention of that because we said we would. and Anjani has fortunately reminded me. Where does all of this fit in? You'll see when we study the 12 Kalis, when we go all the way up, especially when you hit like Mrityu Kali, Sanghara Kali, Mrityu Kali, once you get to Mrityu Kali, you find that the other Kalis are spoken of in a way that doesn't quite immediately make sense. Wait, let me just pull up the document so you can see them. Okay, look at this. So when you look at the Kalis, most of them up to Mrityu Kali will make sense. But then Rudra Kali onwards to Mahabhairava Chandogra Ghora Kali won't really, for most of us. So Shrishti Kali is when an object manifests internally, and Rakta Kali is when we then react towards it, either through attraction or aversion. So this we all understand. For instance, if I take a sip of tea right now, I become aware of the taste of tea, which is manifesting internally. Then I move towards it because I like it, or I don't like it and I reject it. Both are expressions of Rakta Kali. But once I sense it as an other to me, I'm suddenly possessed with this desire to make it me. So this is called Sthiti Nasha Kali, which means I want to reabsorb it and start to savor it or internalize it, even if it's something I don't like. Because if it's something I don't like, I want to get it to go away, which is another way of saying I want to bring it back to its source. I want to reabsorb it, internalize it so I can be finished with it. So even if it's something I like, or whether it's something I hate, in both cases, Sthiti Nasha Kali is the energy which helps me reabsorb it. But before I do that comes this inexpressible Anakya Yamakali, where I'm like unsure of whether or not I want to digest it. Maybe it's a purity rule that I'm afraid of, or I don't feel like I deserve the experience, or if it's a difficult experience, I don't feel like I'm strong enough to digest it. Like there's a feeling, Yamakali is a feeling of hesitation before digesting it. No, and thank you for bringing this up, Anjali, because this is actually the overture of the whole lecture, the point I actually really wanted to make. So yeah, we get stuck here usually, but this we understand. Now, let's say we get past Yamakali, which is the ability to fully internalize an object, which is very hard actually. Usually we don't feel like we deserve it, or we don't feel like we can handle it, or our attention is not present enough to be fully with an experience. But let's say we manage to do it. If we fully absorb the object in Sanghara Kali, then in Mrityu Kali, we will get a sense of, my very nature is to reabsorb, which in another way is saying you can fully savor the experience you just had. Because the object was manifested, albeit internally, it was then seen as an other to you. Then you had this desire to reabsorb it, and you start to do so, except suddenly you catch yourself and you wonder whether or not you should or whether or not you can. And then if you actually manage to reabsorb it in Sanghara Kali, you're left with this deep sense of abiding, you savored it. And then it's possible to enter into Rudra Kali, where you start to perceive the samskara left over from that perception. Now, this is very, very subtle. What does it mean to perceive a samskara? Is this an aftertaste? Like you eat chocolate and then you sit with the experience for a while and then there's the aftertaste of chocolate? Yes, but something even subtler than that. It's the underlying psychic residue left over by an experience. And this is an order of experience that's far too subtle for most of us, I think. It's very deep to be with the samskara of the experience. But let's say for now it's just the aftertaste. Let's make it sound a little bit more plausible that we can do this. So it's just an aftertaste, okay? So we're there with that. Then, more importantly, we perceive that there is an instrument through which that samskara was attained, or through which that reality which left a samskara was attained. This is called the solar mandala of the 12 faculties, the 5 organs of perception, the 5 organs of action, the buddhi, and the manas. These are our 12 solar rays. And the Ahankara is called the Martanda Bhairava or Mantana Bhairava, the Lord of the Circle. So you reabsorb the instrument. At this point, let's say you enjoyed a piece of chocolate or something. At this point, the samskara is totally gone. You've forgotten all about chocolateness. And more importantly, you don't really perceive through the eyes, ears, nose, skin, tongue anymore. You don't feel your legs or arms or anus or genitals or mouth anymore. Like at this point, all the 12 rays of the solar mandala are gone, and you feel your pure sense of egoity, which is like you're resting in that projected self, which is the agent of cognition and action. The cognizing and the acting is gone, but the impression of the agent remains. So the taste of chocolate, the prameyam, the known, the tasting of chocolate through the tongue, the pramana, the knowing, those are gone. All that's left is the sense of the pramatar, the knower, which here is called the ego, the agent of cognition and action. Now in Paramarka Kali, that is absorbed. The ego is absorbed. And then we're in a very deep state of meditation at this point, actually. This is called Kalagni Rudra Kali. Here, we don't even feel like we are the taster of chocolate. We forgot about chocolate, we forgot about tasting, and we forgot about I, the taster of the chocolate. Now there is a pure sense of I, which is not at all related to the cognition or the action just performed. It's a primordial sense of I that's prior even to the ego that identifies with the solar mandala of the 12 faculties. It's a very subtle thing, this Purusha. So this Purusha then gets reabsorbed by the Kala Agni Rudra Kali. And then in Mahakala Kali, this is a very high spiritual state. In this state, you no longer feel your individuality. See, in Kala Agni Rudra Kali, you feel the most you've ever felt because it's the most individual you can be. That is to say, it's the most primal source of you that you know until you get to Mahakali, where there's no sense of being a me anymore. You are now all perceivers everywhere. So you get the sense that I am everybody. This is a very exalted state. Right? Like this would be the fullest realization for some traditions. I'm no longer Nish. I'm no longer Digambari. I'm no longer Ruth. I'm no longer Thomas. I am that which is looking through every pair of eyes. Very, very profound state. You're one with all. Then that must get devoured too. Then this next state, which is so mysterious, Mahabhairava Chandogra Ghora Kali, even that goes away. The void is devoured by the void, or the fully expanded self is even that is even devoured. Okay, my God, like how do we access this stuff? Like everything up till here makes sense, but this stuff seems a little bit out of what usually happens when we perceive like the taste of chocolate or something. So one argument here is that these are very advanced, and sometimes when we present this, we tend to present it as if it's not as advanced as it is. It's pretty advanced spirituality, and it's premised upon a lot of stuff that we're now slowly uncovering together and learning together. But another way of looking at this, which I wanted to actually argue today, and I'm very thankful because I almost forgot to do this until Anjani Ma reminded me. But this is the idea. Notice, I've given a very non-dual reading of the 12 Kalis, haven't I? Like the Krama Stotra, of course, is very Advaitic. Like it's a very non-dual tradition, the Kali tradition. So I've read these 12 Kalis as faculties, as powers of consciousness. I'm reading them all as aspects or a cycle or a sequence of consciousness, and I'm reading the ultimate reality, which is here called Kali Sankarshini, or Kala Sankarshini, the 13th Kali, if you will, as you. I've given a non-dual reading of it, right? But wait a minute. In this non-dual tradition, the Kalis are prayed to. They are me. They are the faculties of my own consciousness. And yet, Kaularnavananda Ghanormi Rupam Unmesha Meshubhaya Bhajamantaha. We're praying to them. I always praise that Kali of a mission who blooms and recedes like a wave of bliss in the ocean of the Kaula. I always praise that passionate Kali who manifests this world and who savors the world during a pause in dissolution. She who happily drinks the nectarian blood offered to the circle of the mothers by the heroes, the tantric adepts. I salute that peaceful one, the Kali who destroys stasis, who is there in the coming and going of the breath, and who is there in the perfect union of the breath, which is set in motion by the wheel of wind, who dissolves all notions of purity impurity. I prostrate before that Kali who, out of desire for the play of the great devouring and controlling the world, dissolves Yama, the controller, who controls the destruction of things. Notice, all of this stuff is intensely devotional. Now, how is it that in a non-dual tradition that sees God as synonymous with the self, there's all this devotion? The point I want to make in closing is that you can interact with the 12 Kalis as a Shaiva Siddhantin would. In other words, you can approach Kali dualistically. Right? It's almost as if sometimes we don't give ourselves that permission. We don't allow ourselves to see Kali as the other. But in this case, even though the 12 Kalis are faculties of consciousness, they're so deep and embedded in such a deep layer of reality that for this ego, which feels itself to be superficially embedded in reality, to this ego, it's as good as God, in that I should relate to it as a dualistic other who can protect me and take care of me. So I just wanted to present this way of working with the 12 Kalis. Instead of seeing them as faculties of consciousness, see them as 12 aspects of Kali, who is deity, who is goddess. And then pray to each and every one of these aspects as needed. So for instance, if you're having an experience that you're just struggling to internalize, you might pray to Samhara Kali. Mother, help me fully absorb this experience. And you chant the hymn to Sanghara Kali. Then, let's say you're struggling with a pattern that just keeps coming up. It's not related to a particular experience. It's just a samskara that gets triggered by experiences that even superficially resemble that old one. Good. Then, pray to Mrityu Kali, who devours that samskara. Say you have a problem with egoity. Like for some reason you feel stuck. Oh, sorry, you pray to Rudra Kali. Rudra Kali will help you devour that subtle impression. But say the egoity just seems to be so stuck, like I can't get rid of this idea that I am the doer, I am the knower, I am the actor. In that case, pray to Martanda Kali, who can dissolve it. Or arguably even Paramarka Kali. Martanda Kali, or more likely Paramarka Kali, will dissolve that ego. See, each of these Kalis, like the Dasha Mahavidyas, can be considered aspects of one Kali. And you can pray to that specific aspect for whom that particular situation would be most appropriate. Do you see? It's not like there are 12 different deities here. There are 12 aspects of one deity, and by appealing to these different aspects, you can get a different response from Kali, in a sense. So be careful with Mahabhairava Chandrogra Kali, of course, because that's like destroy the whole universe. But again, don't be careful, because another thing is like you can trust her completely. And it's possible, Abhinava Gupta seems to imply, he's like, I don't want to give out this mantra because if I do, you might destroy the whole universe, which could be upsetting for some people. Like, what do you call it? Like a DMT experience they weren't ready to have. Like somebody just comes up to you and blows in your face some DMT and then whoop, the world just vanishes. You'd be pretty upset, right? And it's happened. Like this idea of like everything goes up in numbers. Almost like matrixy, the whole thing goes like the pixels all fade away and then you're fucked. Then what are you gonna do? Which can happen if you use certain mantras, like that KH mantra, the KHPH mantra. Those who Tantrāloka offers that particular destruction mantra, the Super Sanghara Kali mantra, right? Like that mantra, if you chant it once, and it doesn't always happen, but if you chant it once, it can destroy the whole universe because it's that Mahabhairava Chandogra Ghora Kali mantra. Anyway, so like these Kalis, they can be appealed to dualistically. So I just wanted to offer that in closing. Now that we said a few things about Shaiva Siddhanta, now that we sketched out the whole Shaiva world, I hope you're inspired by the richness and the diversity. No, the entire universe. That's why I'm like, this isn't just us. Because at this point, remember, this is why it's kind of difficult with these Kalis, because at this point, there is no longer your universe. That ended over here, right? Like everything up to here is your personal universe. Once you go here, you've already entered into the intersubjective universe, the one that we all share. Except at this point, you will feel like the one behind all ones, behind all people. And that gets destroyed over here. So here, your individual universe gets destroyed. Here, the universe gets destroyed. Right? That's the crazy thing about this. Yeah, it's Thanos core or something like that. It's like you've collected all of the infinity. What is it like? Is it rings? You've collected all the infinity rings. Is it? Sorry, I'm really aging myself in this moment. I don't have kids, so I never. Again, I don't think you need kids to go and see that film. But I don't know. Like I never wanted to see that film. But I saw memes about it, so it's good as knowing it. These days, we won't even read the tantric text anymore. We'll just receive it through the memes about it. So it's a meme-based education. So yeah, in the memes, I think they are rings. But yes, so yes, once you collect all 12 of them, then yes, you can destroy the entire universe. with a prayer to that particular Kali. So therefore, she's quite hush hush. In any case, I think the closing sentiment here should be, don't be afraid of duality. Like dualistic Shaivism has a lot to offer, and we'll go into it much more on another occasion. Sri Ramakrishna started with basic duality, like just the sense of there is God, and other people have seen her. Why can't I? And that gave him access to the whole gamut of spiritual experience. But that should not be belittled. And day in, day out, Advaitins all around the world belittle it, probably because of religious trauma that they've had. But the reason they've experienced that religious trauma is because they experienced one flavor of duality. But there are other flavors of duality out there, much more life affirming, much more empowering versions of duality. Hopefully, like the one we just sketched out. That being said, duality rocks actually. It's sweet and it's beautiful, and we should always give ourselves permission to participate in religion in that way. So may this be an offering to Sadhyo Jyoti and all the great dualist masters who were bold enough in their time to stand up for one of the most natural and sweetest ways of relating to God ever. Seeing God as the other and then just loving the shit out of that. May this be an offering to all dualists. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanam Astu. Jai Shiva. Jai Bole.